Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Critical Podcast. I'm your host. My name is Jimmy Good, and joining me this week is an incredibly special guest, returning guest, Mr. Manny. Manny Perez, how you doing, buddy?
Hello. It's so good to see you, dude. I absolutely adore you and the work you
Ah,
do. And so I'm just honored and super stoked to be here, particularly because of the topic, but also just an excuse to hang out with you is a great excuse. So thanks
well,
for having me, dude.
thank you. Well, I mean, thank you. I was gonna say you're gonna make me blush. Just stop it. You know what? The feeling is more the mutual. And the funny thing was, and it's kind of, I don't know if it's serendipitous, but I've been kind of going through Lord of the Rings. We've been talking about it here, and I saw
Mhm.
you kind of tweet that out. You're talking about Return of the King, and I was like, oh my
Yeah,
gosh, like let me just ask Manny if he wants to be on to talk about Two Towers because he's another Lord of the Rings guy more than I am, because you know the books very well as well.
sure.
So I was like, oh man, we should just ask him to be on the show. So I was like, all right, we'll see
Yeah.
if he's busy and
And it's
have him on.
funny. It's funny. I tweeted. It was like, I guess I'll start watching the Return of the King at 3 a.m. because of the weird times we're in. My sleep schedule is bananas. And Lord of the Rings, the movies are like my blanket. They're like the comfort food. They bring me home. They're just, they're perfect. So yeah, I'm so glad you saw that. I'm so glad you reached out, man. I'm
Yeah,
stoked.
dude, I couldn't agree more with all of that. I had a friend, I still have a friend, I should say, that used to like he would watch Fellowship,
Yeah.
like at night because it would like help him fall asleep. But
Oh,
like,
totally.
and like that's a good thing, but also a bad thing. Cause like the times you want to watch it, you don't want to like
Yeah.
hit that like hour and a half mark, and you're
Yeah.
like,
You're like,
I'm
I'm
gonna fall asleep. Yeah, it's like
sleepy.
no, you gotta wake up, man.
Yeah.
Rivendell, woo. Like
Yeah.
it's like
Exactly.
okay, keep with it. But anyway, so for those people who don't know, obviously we talk about movies on this show, but we like to talk about games and everything in entertainment, music, theme parks, stuff like that. But we are specifically talking about one of the greatest film franchises of all time, my favorite film trilogy of all time ever. It's the greatest. I love it so much. We're talking about Lord of the Rings. We talked about Fellowship of the Ring. We're talking about the Two Towers today specifically. All right. So for those people who have not seen those movies yet, which is kind of amazing because they've been out for almost 20 years, which is kind of freaky.
Crazy.
That like is
That's
like
so
it's
freaky.
like, oh man, that's
Yeah.
kind of hard on my heart, but
Yep.
still holds true. But we're gonna go through it. We're gonna go in depth, so all the spoilers, all that stuff. But I think it's probably best to start at the beginning, which this movie has one of the craziest intros I think in almost any film I've seen, and that might sound hyperbolic, but it's nuts because you start off with just looking at the beautiful mountains of New Zealand, or I should say Middle Earth, and you're like, okay, this is pretty. This is Lord of the Rings, and then you start to hear some stuff, and you're like, what's going on? And you're immediately taken back to Fellowship, one of the most like depressing and
Yep.
crazy climactic moments. It's Gandalf versus the Balrog. Like, Manny, like, when you see this again, like, how does it make you feel?
Oh man, it makes me feel a lot. And it's cool. Like the beginning of that intro, you're seeing the mountains, and it like re-familiarizes you with sort of where it left off, right? Where the Fellowship leaves off is sort of like this like ambiguous, like what's going to happen kind of story. Sam joins Frodo in the canoe, and it's cool because like you're immediately exposed to like the setting, and you're like, oh yeah, I'm back in Middle Earth. This feels familiar and this feels good. But then it brings you to like one of the hardest moments in the trilogy, right? Seeing Gandalf fall off the bridge of Khazad-dûm, and it's crazy because when you actually get a glimpse behind the curtain of like what happened after he fell, you're like, oh my god, like
Yeah.
we're doing this right now, like this is happening right now in the first 5 minutes. And then you see all that action, and it's one of the coolest scenes. And then just like that, Frodo wakes up, and you have that moment of like, whoa, 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 what? Like, what happened? And so um, it's this really cool exposure to the setting, followed immediately by this like real intense, like heavy-handed, did it happen or did it not happen kind of thing.
Oh yeah, totally. And I love that when you get to Sam and Frodo,
Mhm.
they're talking, and basically Frodo after a moment he's like, Gandalf didn't mean for a lot of things to happen to Sam, and
Yeah,
like that kind of ties back in, and you're like, that's where the gears are starting to turn. Even though putting the trailer aside, which unfortunately for this movie shows Gandalf returning,
right, right.
like that moment you're kind of like, well, is he is he like still around? But that
Yeah,
whole sequence, which is good because I was watching the extended edition, and that first chunk, that hour and 46 minutes or whatever, there's
yep,
like no action except
yeah,
for that beginning intro,
Yep.
which I thought was so funny because I thought it was a cut during kind of the Warg attack, but that's like the beginning of the next
Right.
half there. But I was like, okay, so there's like kind of that action set piece, which is so crazy because like you think of Gandalf, I think a lot of us kind of put him in with like the rest of the Fellowship when you've seen him fight. You're like, okay, like this is what the guy's capable of. But then
Sure.
it's like shoots into like super mode where he's like he's flying down, grabs his sword, and he's like,
It's
if I'm
so
going
cool.
down, I'm gonna kill this guy. And there's that shot where they pull out, and for some odd reason in my younger brain when I was because I didn't know the difference between this and Hobbit, I always thought that was like the same lake that like Gollum had been at, because they like pull out and there's like they play the music and you just see like the fire and stuff. It's just like this huge,
and
massive
the scale,
lake.
the scale of that, like the first shot is like close up. The Balrog's huge. Gandalf is tiny. You're seeing the scale of the fight. The sound that it makes when he grabs the sword on his way down, like gives me chills. It's so good. And then suddenly, you're right. That shot, that huge wide shot, and they're like the size of a penny on your screen falling. You're like, oh my God, what is this thing? And they like land in this lake, and you're like, what is even happening? So it's one of my favorite intros. And it just, man, it hits on so many different parts, both like chronologically, you're like, where can I fit this into the story? Like like you said, the gears are turning. And then also just like emotionally, you're like, oh my God, like you said, is he still around? Like what's the story here? And once we start talking about Gandalf, we can get into it, but like the character of Gandalf, knowing where he's from and knowing like his true form and all that, like really, once you like learn that stuff, your mind will just spin because it's so intense.
Oh, totally. And like you said, the juxtaposition between that kind of crazy action sequence and then it's back to Sam and Frodo, kind of, it's like huge. It's like, that's what Lord of the Rings is. It has these moments that are like, you can't even, they're so big. And then it's like back down to like the smallest possible group. And you're like, but it changes and it's not jarring. It's just, it feels like we're just focusing on a different portion of it. Because I think like other sagas try to do that and maybe it doesn't work as well, but like we're just so familiar with the characters. And
definitely,
I think it's just it's so gripping. Like you just watch and you're like, oh my gosh. But then there's like the Sam and Frodo stuff, in the beginning of this film, which we'll kind of maybe get into the differences between the regular and extended edition, which I feel like there's like one or two things that I feel like they desperately needed to put in to the theatrical version. But in the beginning here, we have like a moment with some rope, this elven rope that Sam got, and he's got it tied to a rock and they use it to get down. And he's like, oh, that's one of my knots. It'll never come undone, but it's elven rope, so it comes undone. I was like, I get why that was cut, You're like watching it, but for me as a fan, I'm like, this is fun. I'm like, this is more stuff,
And it's those little bits that build the world, right? And so like you're like, oh yeah, the elven rope, I remember that, and knowing how it works, and like it just makes the world like a place that you understand. And that's one of the most impactful things for me about the trilogy overall. Is just like the world of Middle Earth, the whole setting. It feels like a place. It feels like a really lived-in place. And like, side note, but I'm a huge fan of like survival horror kind of crafting games, right? So like The Forest or Subnautica or 7 Days to Die and the like. And every opportunity I have, if I build like a house or a base and I have the opportunity to name it, I always name it the Shire. It's always like my home base.
Amazing.
It's always like where I come home and where I organize my things. And I think that's just, kind of emblematic of the fact that the movie did an incredible job at making these places feel like home, or making these places feel like, fear and danger. And so the fact that like I pulled those like emotions out of it and I get to put them somewhere else, like that's just a testament about how good that world is built in the films.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And I think because so much of it is steeped in as much realism as they could make it, that brings it to another level where you could go and visit so many of these places and be like, oh my gosh, like it feels so real. Like there's stuff that is done on sound stages and there's green screen stuff here and there, but for the most part, it's like they did as much as they could, as opposed to building like the Tower of Orthanc themselves, which I'm sure at one point, like I wish there was someone who raised their hand, they're like, what if we just build the tower? And they're all like, no, we can't. They're like, but could we?
Like, we have enough money and material. No. Okay,
They're like, but then we built that. We have to build Minas Tirith, and that's ridiculous. But it's man. Okay, so to show a little structure here, because as much like Manny and I could just go on, and there wouldn't be. It would just be everywhere. I'm gonna try to break it into kind of two sections, as it were, as far as like the groups, because in the third movie, we kind of get three different ones. In the first movie, we kind of get one storyline. But this one is kind of divided up more so into two. Kind of, I guess I should say three because I Merry and Pippin, obviously.
Sure.
But for the most part, there's kind of the two major storylines going on here. Frodo and Sam on one end, and then Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, and everybody else in Rohan kind of fighting for their lives. But because we're talking about Frodo and Sam here, we're going to kind of, I think we'll start with that group because it's smaller, because we get a crazy addition to this little duo. Some people might forget that he's in here, but his name is Gollum. You might like think back to, oh, I'm just kidding. He's one of the most like crazy, amazing characters. And man, oh man, does that CGI ever hold up? Like, to start off with him, like, we'll get to the performance, but looking at this stuff, I feel like you look at Fellowship and you get like just a little bit of him here and there, Gollum. And then in this one, you're like, wow, like this is, it's so good.
And for like an early 2000s film, you're right. It holds up tremendously. It still looks very slick.
Oh my gosh, amazing.
Yeah. And again, testament to the performer for sure. Andy Serkis is a literal wizard, but it still holds up great. And the character of Gollum is really, really interesting.
I think framing wise, we talked about that shot with the Balrog and Gandalf, but like the first shot we get of Gollum like climbing down the cliff and the moon's behind him, and he looks so sinister. It's so great. And then there's that kind of duality between his personalities with Gollum and Smeagol, and you always know who's talking. That's the crazy thing about it, because there's the changes are just enough in the voice to be like, oh, I know who's talking here. I know who's talking here. And his arc throughout this movie, which is funny because like a lot of these characters kind of have an arc more so throughout all of the films, but with this one, it's very like, it's, he's back down, like he's Gollum in Return of the King. Like in this one, it's like, I'm kind of both, and like it's tragic.
And you feel bad for him, and you really like empathize with him because Tolkien has this theory that things are good when they're born. Like, we're innately good, and evil doesn't exist until corruption exists. And I think Gollum is the most perfect example of corruption turning an innocent hobbit, evil, right? And to your point about, seeing the differences, if you look carefully, his pupils change depending on who's talking.
Oh, really?
And so, he's Gollum. His pupils are tiny, tiny, tiny. They're very creepy, like very sinister. They're like pinholes. And when he's Smeagol, when he's having that like side of the dialogue, his pupils are huge, like a cute cat. And so there's little things like that really pull at your heartstrings. I mean, that's the same reason we think babies are cute and cats are cute, puppies, because their eyes, and there's like some biological scientific thing, but it's like the proportion between the size of the head compared to the size of the eyes.
Yeah.
So when you look at Smeagol and you see him talking, his eyes are big. They're like saucers. And so you biologically are like, oh my God, this thing is adorable. And I feel bad, but then he goes back to Gollum and he's talking about killing Frodo and killing Sam and taking the ring. And so you're right. It's this crazy roller coaster. And it is tragic. It's super tragic. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that makes more sense now, because like when you see the T-Rex in Jurassic Park, when its eye gets small because of the light, I'm like, that's evil Rexy. But the rest of the time, she's good. She's a good person.
Yeah. No, she's great. Yeah.
It's National Dinosaur Day for people when we recorded this. So that's why we're talking about dinosaurs.
Yeah.
Anyway, that is amazing. I did not realize that. And again, that just goes to show the testament to the detail in these films, like that minute thing, which is so crazy to me. Because speaking of eyes, I've been trying to look at Legolas's, because I swear sometimes they're brown. I think they're always blue, but like they're not as pronounced as they are in The Hobbit. In The Hobbit, they're like, let's do bright blue as much as possible. But like these ones, it seems so much more natural.
Totally.
I don't know if I'm the only one who gets that.
No, I think I definitely feel that too. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of strange. But speaking about with just Andy Serkis, and I think one of maybe the greatest, if you call it a dialogue, I suppose, is kind of a monologue too, but his back and forth where they start to have a little bit of fun with the camera, where both Frodo and Sam are sleeping after they've worked out a deal with him, and Smeagol is basically trying to fight Gollum off in him. And there's this kind of panning shot where they're talking to each other at first, and then it starts to cut between the two, which is great, because then you're like, okay, it's a clear distinction between each one. And I feel like right there, you get such an interesting, like, it's like two characters, but it's one character. There's so much nuance to it, but it's over the top at the same time. I don't know. It's just such a good performance. It's like, how are you doing this, man? Like, how did you do this? Like,
totally. And like everything he does, I mean, he's done things with Planet of the Apes. He's done so much with his body. And I think that's such an important thing for CGI. you don't want it to look janky and you don't want it to look like CGI. So to get a guy like Andy Serkis, I think like, man, what an amazing casting, because he was able to convey so much in the way he used his body, and the way that he used his facial features. I think he's a wizard. He can do so much with not even speaking. But I mean, like, I can't even imagine the challenge it was to flip flop back and forth between Smeagol and Gollum. Like, it's hard to keep those straight when you're trying
Yeah.
to act and when you're trying to enunciate and use your body in so many ways. So just an amazing, amazing performance for sure.
And like for people who've watched the behind the scenes, like I'm sure you and I both have, like there's an instance later on where you see Smeagol trying to catch a fish in a river, and he's kind of running and jumping over the rocks and kind of smashing into stuff. Like Andy Serkis legitimately did that. Like he
Yeah.
like threw himself into rocks and water to do this. And I'm not talking about the forbidden pool stuff. I mean like he's like a stream that is not that deep, and he's just like over all of that. It's like that's commitment. Like
Oh yeah.
that's insane. And
Yeah.
man, and like I think that guy deserves. Everybody praises him, and I think he really deserves more accolades than he gets. But he's been such a great addition to this
For
whole
sure.
thing. And this was like kind of his big break. Like I didn't know him before this. You know, it was just
Yeah.
a wholly new thing. And for me, 11, 12, 13, when I first saw these, this is a very different villain than I'd ever really seen before, because most of the villains
Definitely.
I got, you know, back in the day especially, it was very like, this is bad guy and he's always bad forever. Like the only one with nuance was like Darth Vader, but I only got that like in Return of the Jedi more
Sure.
so. But like all the other villains were like, this is evil guy, better
Yep.
destroy him. You know, with
Yeah.
Gollum, it's like you want to save him, and then when it does, it obviously puts strain on Frodo and Sam, but it gives
Right.
Frodo this interesting kind of feeling of like he is now existing between these two worlds of like what he used to be, kind of wants to be, but then also like what he could become.
Yeah.
Just so
Yeah.
cool. It's so
It's
great.
yeah, it's really fascinating. And I again, if you think about the idea of like evil corrupting good, right? Like Gollum isn't the bad guy. He's not the villain. He's a pawn of the villain,
Yeah.
right? And but he's painted as this villain, and your initial reaction is like, no, like screw Gollum. He's trying to get the ring. He's trying to kill Frodo. He's trying to kill Sam, et cetera, et cetera. But if you zoom out a little bit, you really see the fact that Gollum he's just a tool for Sauron, and that's essentially what it comes down to, right? And so you do go on this wild ride of like, I want to save him. I want him to be good, especially if you once you see him as Smeagol, once you see him as the Hobbit, and you actually see Andy Serkis playing him, and you're like, oh man, like this was a person, and he was corrupted by evil.
Yeah.
Super fascinating too if you think about what the hobbits represent, right? Tolkien spent a lot of time in these kind of idyllic, like almost like farm towns in his youth, and you see so much of that in the Shire and in the people that are in the hobbits, right? They love pipeweed, and they like beer, and they're salt of the earth kind of people, and so it frames them as like such a great opportunity to corrupt, right? Because they're just like happy people living on their own, doing their own thing, and like for the most part, they've stayed uncorrupted. But Smeagol and Gollum, he's one of those like offshoots that kind of like leaked out and got exposed to the evil, right? And you're right, you see Frodo as like almost a moderator, living between Gollum and living between Sam. Sam representing his home, the Shire, the salt of the earth, and Gollum representing the evil, the corruption, and watching, and of course, testament to Elijah Wood, but watching him struggle with that corruption is just incredible.
Oh, totally. And I think a lot of people, for some reason, they kind of have a frustration with Frodo, and I don't know if I get it as much. I understand like a lot of people, maybe he's a very an active protagonist, but that sometimes he gets lost in the shuffle because there's so many other kind of big, bold. You put him next to like Aragorn and Gandalf, and it might not seem like he's as active as they are.
Right.
But it's
Right.
because he's just. I always try to think of it as like if I told you to go on a huge quest, but I was like, but here's the trick: I'm gonna make you carry like 500 pounds on your back the whole time,
Right.
and you're like you might not want to like be like, oh, I'm the nicest guy, or I'm not gonna be
Totally.
like chatting with you all the time. It's like I've got this huge thing, and it's also something that I'm started like not really eating. I stay up all night just staring at that 500 pounds that I'm carrying with me,
Yeah.
and like you just like that's your whole life is like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
like that's
And the psychological 500 pounds, so to speak, is the ring. It's that corruption,
exactly.
and the burden, the responsibility, even,
Yeah.
right? Like, I can't even imagine what he must have felt. I can't think of a time, certainly in my life, that I was like, man, I am carrying this responsibility and this burden. Maybe when I have kids or something, but like, for now, I'm like, I can't even put myself in his shoes, because that, the task that he has must have broken him in so many ways.
Yeah. What I would have loved to have seen a little bit in Return of the King, just like one little line. I would love it if Frodo stopped eating the lambus bread and he started saying like, that actually tastes really bad, because
Yeah.
like Gollum can't eat it. He's like, I can't eat Hobbit food, but also I forget like the elven rope. I didn't realize this, after watching the extended for like the second time ever, maybe. I was like, oh, like they have it around his neck. He's like, it burns us, and I was like, oh, he's just saying that because like it hurts. But like, I
Right.
think it's literally because it hurts him to have like this elven like
Yeah.
magic around him, because that's like good and he's evil, and he's like, I just can't, like, you got to get away
Totally.
from me. So like, again, Gollum has been corrupted over so long with this thing,
Yep.
so obviously that's gonna have more of an effect. But it would have been cool to see Frodo start to be like, you know what, Sam, like, I'm not really interested in any of the food we have. I really can't eat it. Or he would start to throw up if he tried to eat it, and he'd be like, I just
Yep.
can't anymore. That would have been, I wonder if they've ever,
Definitely.
like, did they ever delve in anything like that with the books?
Not in a super overt way, but I think what the books do really well is juxtapose the different races and
Uh,
what they represent, and sort of what they stand for. And so you see the elves as this kind of like aloof, very elegant, undying, like beautiful thing, and you juxtapose that with like orcs, right? And the Urukai are corrupted elves. They're actually like bred essentially by Sauron. And so like you see all of the races at such a good comparison to one another, because they contrast so greatly.
yeah,
And like the hobbits, again, like representing innocence and representing kind of just this peaceful lifestyle. Tolkien actually wrote the very first words of anything. He wrote the first words of the Hobbit specifically in a trench in World War One, on the back of a sheet of marching paper,
oh wow,
like music paper. He was literally in a trench. He had a trench fever, which was like just absolutely ravaging the soldiers. It's like fevers, and I think it's acquired by like some kind of like trench lice or something.
yikes,
So he was in his worst moments, and on the back of a piece of paper, he wrote, "Out of nowhere, in a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit." And so I think that's really emblematic of like the hobbits are like this. They're so innocent and they're so peaceful and pure because they came out of a really, really, really hard time, right?
yeah,
And so to your point about like the elven rope, I think the books and the films do a great job at saying like, these are the elves, this is who they represent, and if you mix them with evil, like this is the outcome. Like it's like Gollum feeling like he's being burnt by this rope. And so it's just one of the coolest things that it does so well.
dang. See, this is, you have this insight, Manny, and I
I'm
appreciate it. It's so
I'm just
good.
happy to be able to share it, man. This is
It's,
great.
oh, I always share it with me, because I'll be honest with you, I've tried to read the books in the past, and
Mhm.
it's a very steep mountain to climb. It's like fighting
For
the
sure.
Balrog up a mountain. But
Definitely.
I'd love to take that trio here, because they probably could have done the whole thing with just like this portion with them
For sure.
alone almost. But then we get introduced to maybe one of my favorite characters. Over the years has become more and more one of my favorite characters, because I think I start to sympathize or maybe empathize with them a little bit. And that is our reluctant captain of Gondor, Faramir, or
Yep.
Faramir, or however you say it. But such a fun foil to a good old Boromir,
Yep.
who you think, like, it's funny because after Fellowship, you're kind of like, all right, men, you get representation of man in two forms mainly. It's like we've got Aragorn and you've got Boromir. So you've got the hesitant for power, and then you have the greedy for power. But then
Totally.
you get this kind of like in between, again, kind of like the Frodo, if you will, of the
Yep.
men, where he's kind of there. And I think this is such a great character. I think he's done so well. And talking, kind of referring back earlier, when I was talking about the special edition stuff, something I think they could have put in here, or maybe even in Return to the King, to some extent, they maybe could have, is his little 5-minute backstory
Yeah.
between himself, Boromir, and their father, Denethor.
Yeah.
I adore this scene, and I remember seeing it one of the first times, and I was like, "What is this?" I was like, "We're getting more context for this kind of this weird family dynamic that they play
Yeah.
into so much in Return of the King." But in this movie, there's just this 5-minute little thing of like, Boromir's a war hero. Faramir's kind of screwed up in the past, and their dad Denethor, the steward of Gondor, is kind of like, Faramir, you kind of suck, and Boromir, you're my favorite, and you're gonna go get this ring at Rivendell because I can't trust
Yeah.
anybody else to do it. Like that right there, and I also love that Boromir puts on a face with his dad, because like they're kind of talking, Boromir, Faramir, they're talking after the whole thing, and they're kind of having this brotherly moment, and then Faramir's like, oh yeah, he's here, and Boromir's like, can't he give me just like a minute? And then he puts on this whole like, oh father, we took this thing, and then he turns on him right after Denethor kind of goes after Faramir a little bit. Boromir's like, this guy, my brother here, he's trying his best, bud. Like, like, it's just so good. It's like, why wasn't that in the main thing? Kills me.
It's funny because the first time I saw the Two Towers, I watched the extended edition, and I didn't know that it was the extended edition. So then in subsequent viewings, when I didn't see the extended edition, I was like, what is this? Like, where is that scene? Like, that's such an impactful scene. And I think especially for men, for like young men like us, I think, there's a lot. I mean, I have an older brother. Fortunately, my dad was never like, you're my favorite and you're not. But, I think it causes us to reflect a little bit and be like, wow, like father-son dynamics are very intense. And I think, I think this is a really good example of one that is super broken, just to be able to see Denethor so overtly, so right over the plate, just be like, you are my least favorite son. I don't know if you get that. You know what I mean? Like, it was really impactful and super tragic. And you're right. Boromir puts on this face like he's like the all-star quarterback of the family. And he's like, yeah, Dad, that touchdown was for you for sure. And then he's like, but he's doing really well in like band or something, And so like, it's such an impactful moment. And I totally wish it was in the theatrical version because it really helps carry that storyline.
Oh, yeah. And I think there's one line particularly that Denethor says, I know Faramir's uses and they are few. I think that right there sums it up so perfectly, because later on when you see what he does to him in Return of the King, you could see that's like what Denethor's mentality is. And even, and this is more Return of the King talk, but saying to him later on, like, yeah, like, you probably wish, Dad, that I had died and Boromir didn't. And he's like, pretty much. Like,
he's like, yeah, that'd be awesome. Because
like
Faramir.
Usually in movies and stuff, they kind of go for the subtlety of it, and they're like, all right, somebody wouldn't be this mean. But I think there's so much of a license of this kind of poetic fantasy here that these characters are just so brutally honest with people. And sometimes it's in a nice way like that, and sometimes it's in a bad way like that, and sometimes it's in a nicer way where you'll get an Aragorn, again, Return of the King, where he kind of lets Eowyn down very gently, as opposed to being like,
so gently.
I love an elf lady, and you're not the elf lady.
You're like, not it.
Get out. But yeah, that whole Denethor bit, and I love that little kind of, it's not a big reveal of Denethor. Like, I think Denethor's kind of true introduction in Return of the King is so good, because there's so much you can be said by him not sitting at the top. But I love this kind of scene, and I think it's one of the best things about Two Towers. It's like, oh, it's so good to have this whole like Boromir. It's so good.
When you see the amount of like when you see Faramir's reaction to capturing Frodo and realizing that he has the ring, he's like, oh my, stop. I have the ring right here. Oh my God, my dad's gonna be so happy. So like when you see that that moment where he's like, I'm gonna get that touchdown for Dad. Like, this is what I'm gonna do, and I'm gonna be the favorite again. Like, you want him, like, I didn't like him. I was like, no, let him go. Like, Frodo's got this task, et cetera, et cetera. But I was also like, man, this would be such a win for you. Like, you need this more than I do, So he's such a tragic character, Faramir, and just amazingly casted, amazingly played, especially compared to Boromir. Not that his character wasn't amazing. His character is fantastic as well. But having those sort of contrasts against one another, it's just so fun to watch.
Yeah, and I think again, kind of having him in the middle ground, and then you kind of put Boromir as the greedy guy, and then you see Denethor, which adds on this other layer of like, what's the greediest guy going to be? And when you try to kind of explain like the ring of, it's so funny that men think like the ring of power, especially for them, which doesn't make you necessarily invisible for them, but it like, they like think it's this great weapon that's going to like just wreck face. Like, they're like, we get this, we're going to win. And it's like, are you know? And like for us is the we're like, But then there's that moment where I think Faramir really starts to change, where Sam says, he's like, do you want to know how your brother died? Because they find out that Boromir's dead, and they're kind of shocked. But he's like, do you want to know the reason? Like, your big brother, this guy who's unstoppable, he went insane over this thing. And Faramir's probably like, this guy who saved me from Osgiliath and everything, this person I look up to so much, he was corrupted by this. How the heck am I supposed to get past this? And it's one of the few times, outside of Fellowship where you get I call it the offering, the ring with Frodo, but this time it's different. Like Frodo's not sitting there with the ring in his hand going like, do you want it? He's like up against a wall, and Faramir's got a sword like kind of holding it, and he's like, I've got the ring of power. And it's like, again, his test. And they keep talking about Faramir's quality. They're like, all right, like the quality of him, which by the way, in Lord of the Rings, The Third Age, good video game, that's one of his moves. It's called Faramir's quality. I think it's a buff. Awesome. I love that kind of, he like sees that the more time he spends with them. And then when he meets Gollum and stuff, he's kind of like, oh my, and then he kind of sees like, oh, this is like the end game. Like this is what happens to people when you're like,
and like, of course, like the overarching sort of story of man in Middle Earth, it has been one of, it's a strong word to use, but like stupidity. Like almost at every turn, man has been like, I want the ring. And they're like, but it corrupts you and it'll really mess. They're like, nah, don't care. I want the ring. I'm powerful. I want to have that power.
Yeah.
And it's like holding a mirror up to us, right? To like the human race, where we're like, no, power's awesome. Is it going to cause like all these problems? Don't even care, right? And so the moments where, again, that test, that the challenge, the offering, where it's like where men, they realize the error of their ways, and they're like, wait, I should think about this, because again, I'm seeing the end game here. Those moments really, really shine, because for most of the trilogy, you're seeing like men just absolutely blow it at every turn.
Yeah.
And we get deeper into that with Aragorn, of course, and his sort of challenge, and his test is a little more beefy throughout the trilogy. But those small moments of seeing man be faced with the choice, and when they make the right choice, it always feels great.
Oh, totally. Even if it is kind of hard fought, and unfortunately sometimes you get it in the form of somebody dying, like with Boromir, where he kind of like realizes it and he feels bad immediately, but then he kind of fights to save other hobbits, and you're like, okay, he has a good death. It's not like he goes insane and then dies, and you're like, well, and the acceptance.
I feel conflicted.
Yeah, exactly. And his acceptance of Aragorn and all that stuff too. It's great. Yeah. But I think Faramir's so good, and you start to see. Like, and I think they kind of throw him a bone a little bit. I shouldn't say it that way, but in Return of the King, like they're kind of like, he's standing next to Eowyn and maybe things are okay but like he has such a rough go after this. Like you start to see some really sad things happen. You're like, oh, Faramir, like you've been like, there's no amount of counseling, I think, or therapy that's going to get you through. Yeah. It's like, I almost died and my dad tried to burn us alive, and it's totally fine. It's like, it's okay.
He really gets kicked, and then when he's down, kicked even more. This is a weird comparison to make, but I recently, for the first time ever, watched all of Breaking Bad. I don't know if that's a show you've seen.
Dude, yes.
So like I just binged it with a friend of mine for the first time ever. We've just been watching on like a Netflix party. And it's like Jesse. Like Jesse just gets kicked at every turn by everyone, and he's manipulated and beaten, and like literally and figuratively. And so I don't know. I think there's like a common thread between those two characters, because it's like they want to do the right thing. They want to have power, but they also want to do the right thing. And they just get kicked down at every turn, at every single turn.
I was gonna say Jesse's the one I was thinking of when you brought up Breaking Bad. I'm like, he's gonna say it's Jesse, and I'm like, I totally see that for sure.
Totally,
yeah. And to kind of wrap up the Faramir stuff, like we get to Osgiliath and all this, and I love his kind of his back and forth with Gollum, where he is talking to Gollum, kind of Smeagol Gollum. Gollum's still kind of in transition until the very end, but
sure,
he kind of chokes him out the first time. He's like, you're gonna bring him back like Cirith Ungol, like you, like he's like, Frodo, I'm letting you go. My life is forfeit, basically. But I don't think it's probably a great idea that you're going to try to sneak up here, because there's some sort of dark terror that lives up there. And if this guy's going to lead you up there, I think it's a bad idea. And then he kind of like, he sadly lets them go after Sam's kind of like, you've shown your quality. And, Faramir's like, well, at least somebody likes me. And then they're leaving, and he pins Gollum up again. He's like, may death come swiftly to you if they come to harm. And it's like, he's not saying like he's going to kill him. He's like, but if you ever mess with these guys, I hope you're just a dead man. And it's like, ugh, like it's a good threat. It's like, I love it.
And again, it highlights the story of Smeagol and Gollum, where it's like, there's a quote from Gandalf. I think it's actually in it's in the Fellowship, when they're just getting to the mines, and Gandalf and Frodo are having a conversation, and Frodo is like, he says something like, I hope he dies, or why don't we just kill him or something? And Gandalf is like, don't. I'm going to beef up the words, but it's essentially like, don't be so swift to deal out death or something like that.
Death and Judgment, dude.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so it's that same thing where it's like, you know, Gollum is such an integral part of the story, and Smeagol is such an integral part of the story. But at the same time, like, I don't know, like, imagine a movie where Gollum dies halfway through or something, or Faramir kills Gollum. Like, what a different dynamic that they would be. Arguably, the ring would never be destroyed, kind of thing.
Oh,
But
sure. Yeah.
yeah, it's so good the way those storylines are interwoven. It's really masterful.
Yeah, well, and even Frodo at one point says, he's like, now that I do see him, I do pity him. And
Yeah,
there's this kind of thing where they talk about Bilbo, like staying his hand out of pity. And that's maybe one of the most impactful moments back in Unexpected Journey, where you
yeah,
see Bilbo saying, and he could easily kill Gollum, but he's just like, nope. And that moment right there is like the reason I feel like that the ring has a chance to get destroyed. It sounds so
totally.
crazy, but it's like this really minute little moment, but
Yeah,
it's like, nope, just gonna show a
yeah,
little restraint here. And was if this was like just a regular man, I don't know if Aragorn, if in the same position, I don't know if he would have had a little like whispers in the dark or like a little back and forth.
sure.
He probably would have been like, yeah, I'm just gonna snap your neck. Like you'd have been
Yeah,
like, I'm not gonna deal with this. Like, oh,
totally,
cool ring.
totally.
This seems like, oh yeah, my dad's dad had a problem with this thing, so probably shouldn't hold on to it too long. But
Right.
yeah, I do. Man, and I think that's weirdly like that's the through line, and maybe that's kind of some of the stuff you jump back to that isn't always as compelling as some of the stuff like the forward momentum of all the stuff with Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli. But
Yep.
it's very very crucial, and it's always underlying. And then they cut back to it, and you see the ring race now, complete with fell beasts, which I like. Maybe they're not. I think they're more intimidating on the horses, but it's cool to have like these old
Oh
the
yeah.
ghosts of the kings like flying around, and when
100%.
now like Frodo's got like a sense for them. He's like, they're here, and like like
Yeah.
Faramir's like, oh great. He's like,
Yeah.
this is the worst day ever.
Yeah.
But I think it's a good thing to kind of be sprinkled in and out, and that's the main driving story, even if it isn't always like pushing it all the way. You know what I mean? With like
Sure.
it's not like Frodo's not in the middle of a battle. Like he's not out there with a sword like stabbing, like that. He's
Yeah.
like just trying to. He's kind of behind enemy lines for so much, and he's just kind of like, I'm just trying to get through. Like I'm just trying to sneak through. This is really hard. 500 pounds on my back. Like
Yeah.
he's like, please,
Yeah.
please.
Don't mind me.
Yeah. But I do enjoy that portion of it. So there's that chunk, right?
Yeah.
There's that. And I think we should talk about Merry and Pippin here for a little bit to kind of segue into some more hobbits. The start of Merry and Pippin stuff is maybe some of my favorite because I wrote this down as a note. The makeup for the Uruk-hai and the orcs, it really can't be understated.
Oh,
I'm
it's
telling you,
amazing.
it is. I don't think it belongs on any sort of scale because I don't think any scale would go high enough. It is incredibly good. Like
Yeah.
the acting, the voice manipulation that they have with these guys, and
Yeah.
like some of the extra stuff where they're like giving Mary some of like some medicine, which is like some Uruk-hai grog or
Yeah.
something, and it's like
Exactly.
disgusting. Like I love that, and then kind of sprinkling a little bit of this interesting dynamic between the Uruk-hai and the orcs that like they don't really get along super well. And there's
Totally.
these different like kind of factions where the Uruk-hai, who's bigger and stronger and there's less of them, kind of tells the orcs, he's like, yeah, these are going to Saruman. And the orcs
Yeah.
are like, okay. It's almost like someone came from corporate, like the orcs are corporate. And they're like,
Yeah.
hey, we're going to need that shipment today. And they're like, yeah, no, it's not going to be done. And they're like, ooh, we're going to
Like,
really
oh,
need
really wish you
that.
would actually get that shipment to me.
It's like, please. But I love all that stuff. I think it's so
Yeah.
cool. And it's cool to have Merry and Pippin like be around and not be immediately killed, so you can kind of see like this society that's
Yeah.
going on.
Yeah,
It's like,
you really do get a glimpse into, especially with the extended edition, you get a glimpse into how they live, and like what the dynamic is. And you're right, it is like this like kind of underling versus corporate structure where it's like they're orcs, they're everywhere, they've always been around kind of thing, but the Uruk-hai are like these super creatures, right? They're stronger, they're faster, they're deadlier. It's funny in college, I took a class called Symbolism and Society in Tolkien's Middle Earth, and it's the best class I've ever taken.
sick.
And I once wrote a 14-page paper on the diet of orcs,
Amazing.
and it got redundant because it's just a lot of meat. And it was a blast to write, but it was honestly just like listing different kinds. It was like horse meat, people meat, warg meat. I don't know how many kind of meats are there, and all of them, all the meats. But yeah, like the kind of culture of the Urukai especially is really fascinating. They are like literally, you know, with the handprint on their faces and on their armor, they're given the blessing. They're like, no, you are my like power, you are my arm, you are my muscle. And so to see that dynamic play within the evil is really interesting. And to your point about having Merry and Pippin there, it's like, you know, the first time I saw it, I was on edge. I was like, it's only a matter of time before they're gutted. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But you know, it's nice that they just get this exposure. They get a nice little glimpse into life on the other side, and they don't die, and it's great. So to see again that just going back to that juxtaposition between the races is it's so great. It's so great, especially when they're put in the same kind of arena.
Oh, for sure. And it's such a crazy thing to have because we've gotten moments of it. I think the biggest ones are kind of like with Saruman interacting
Mm-hmm.
with his underlings, but that's the closest we get to having like a kind of more of like somebody that we could recognize working with or being in the company of these creatures, because most often the dialogue is, you know, with a sword. It's
Yeah,
not so much like, so how do you feel about working for Sauron? Like, there's not
right.
that, you know.
Exactly.
But it's so cool. And you kind of talked about it earlier, touched on it. Now, in the movies, they say that the Uruk-hai are orcs and goblin men put together. But it sounds
Yeah.
like maybe it's different in the book.
Yeah, I might be misremembering, but I'm almost it could also actually have just been the origin story of orcs that they were corrupted elves. I think that's what I'm mistaken
Okay.
here.
That's what I thought
Um,
too, but I could be,
yeah.
yeah.
And so now that you mention it, I think yeah, you're right. The sort of like mutant hybrid that is the Urukai. And it's I don't know, like we see it in so many different ways. We see like Bane from Batman, right, being this like mutant super soldier. We see you remember the Hulk movie with Edward Norton?
Yeah.
The I forget his name, the evil guy that he faced that like juices himself with the stuff and he turns into this abomination.
Yeah. Yep. Mhm.
And so we see that example of like mutant strong bad guy, right? In so many different ways. But I think like this is such an organic version of that where it's like it's not chemicals, it's not some super soldier serum, it's not a suit of armor, it's like genetics that like the evil person built, right? And I think like organic is such a way to describe the trilogy. Like everything, it's before technology, right?
Yeah.
And so just to have this raw organic evil muscle, it's so terrifying. It's really creepy.
Oh, for sure. And I love that it's kind of based on someone who, as Treebeard has himself has said, he's like, Saruman's got a mind for metal, and you know, he's kind of moving away from the old ways, but he's producing things naturally,
Right.
but they're twisted. And so like
Right.
no matter what, and I still have this kind of on running theory in my mind that if Saruman had the chance, he was kind of like, all right, I might not be able to produce as many orcs, but my guys are worth like 3 or 4. So
Totally.
he's like, just in case, I'm gonna make my own army. That's pretty crazy. So if it ever comes to, if we come to blows with Sauron, I could be like, all right, well, you know, or maybe this would kind of keep Sauron in check, where Sauron wouldn't be like the moment that men
Yeah.
were destroyed, that he'd just be like, I'm gonna crush you, Saruman. It's like he's like, oh, this is kind of like my buffer, my shield, like
Yeah.
these gigantic these hulking crazy guys, which you get to see I think a little more in full display in this one, but there's like alerts kind of being an add-on for Fellowship, being this one who could
Totally.
like take a shield and throw it like 30 feet
Oh my God. I
parallel to
love
the
that.
ground. I
Yeah.
love it. It's like
Like a
that guy.
frisbee.
Yeah, I'm like that guy, more of those guys.
Right.
But for people at home who are kind of confused, I still plan on making a video about this. Think of it like squares and rectangles. Like every Uruk-hai could be considered like of orc origin, but not every
Mhm.
orc is an Uruk-hai. So just keep
Yeah.
that in mind. And there's usually like
Yeah.
the orcs are a little more to the ground. They're kind of, they hunch a little bit. Not like the goblins. They're like kind of on all fours. They're real creepy.
Sure.
They're really close to the ground. But the Uruk-hai, strong, like very scary,
Yeah.
like very nice hair. They usually have some pretty good hair.
Yeah.
If
They
you
have
get,
like ponytail action
they
going on.
look great.
Yeah.
And I love that you get and we'll talk about that more in Helm's Deep, but there's that one, there's like a few of the they call them like Uruk-hai leaders or the heroes. There's like one on the rocks who's like backlit and he's like, go
He's like,
forward.
go.
And you're
Yeah.
like, that guy. I like him a
Yeah.
lot.
I think a good comparison to make is like if you look at like apes, right? You have like, I don't know, a spider monkey,
Oh,
that's a
dude.
goblin, right? And then you have like a little bit stronger, like chimpanzee is like an orc. And the Uruk-hai, they're the silverback. They're the silverback gorilla, the lurking mussel. They're all, monkeys. They're all apes. But there's like kind of different classes within them.
Dude, Manny, you're brilliant. That's amazing. That's so great. I will never look into the same way again. Thank you. That's
You're more
wonderful.
than welcome.
I love a silverback. I love those Uruk-hai. They're my
Yeah.
boys. I said save them for Helm's Deep. I can't help it. But anyway, Merry and Pippin,
Yes.
who I think you get so much more out of them, in this one, but then even more so in Return of the King when they get to kind of be apart. And there's more stuff in the extended edition that you get that's a little more fun with them. They're a little more lighthearted, comedic relief.
Yeah.
But their interactions with Treebeard, who voiced by the lovely John Rhys-Davies, who kind of like you like hear him in one thing as Gimli, and then they, obviously he's very different as Treebeard and the way he talks and everything, but very different characters and the kind of relationship they establish with Treebeard, which is it's fun. Like, it's nice to have at least one portion of the movie where you've got some main characters who aren't constantly in danger. Like, they're in a pretty good way, like with Treebeard. Like, they're pretty safe. They're safe enough to like be sleeping on the ground at one point, just like not worrying about a thing. He's like, just sleep. It's okay.
Yeah.
I enjoyed that a lot. How do you feel about like Treebeard and that relationship?
Treebeard is awesome. And I think the Ents in general are such a fascinating race. They are like the keepers of the earth. They've been around forever. And they're these, they can go into these decades long dormant states where they're just trees. Right. But it's so funny. I think like there is a lot of humor to your point about it being funny because, once Merry and Pippin get into Fanghorn Forest, they, they're being chased by this orc, and then Treebeard stomps them out and then picks them up, and he's like confused. He's like, I've never seen these hobbits before. Like, and they're like, no, we're halflings, little folk. And he's like, it sounds like orc magic, like I've never seen this before, you kids with your iPods. Like, there's such a like generational difference. And, he's like a salty, old grumpy man.
Yeah.
He carries Merry and Pippin to this clearing, and he like makes this big Ent noise, and all the other Ents come in, and he's like, he refers to them by their tree. He's like birch and oak and whatever. And then like it cuts to a bunch of different scenes, and like, I don't know, 20 or 30 minutes passes, and it comes back, and basically Merry and Pippin are like, we have to go fight. You guys are big and strong. We got to go wreck Isengard. Like, we have to fight. And they're like, no, like, we don't fight. Ents don't fight. That's our thing. And then, after all these scenes, it cuts back, and Merry and Pippin are like, all right, have you made your decision? Because Treebeard was like, all right, let me talk to my tree friends and we'll get back to you. And Merry and Pippin are like, have you made your decision? And he's like, you know what? We did. And we've agreed that you two aren't orcs. And you're just like, it just blows your mind, right? You're like, oh my God, like, what a long troll. Like, that took like half an hour for that joke to pay off, but it was so good. And frankly needed, right? Like, we're in the middle of all this conflict, and you have this like little slice of like, haha, Middle Earth humor.
Yeah.
And so it's just so great. And I think the way that the Ents kind of decide to take arms is really impactful. They're seeing all this destruction, and they're seeing all the burning that Saruman is doing to the forest, and they get real pissed. And it's such a clear example of like, Isengard and Saruman, and the way he's building his army and the way he's gaining his strength. That's the industrial age. That is what Tolkien saw firsthand. He saw his organic, idyllic world completely warped and completely broken by machines and like the introduction of machines. Like, we have technology right now, we have technology at our fingertips, but imagine being in a place where your world is organic and natural, and then suddenly all of this industrialism shows up and starts blowing smoke in the air and burning things and machinery. And so it's, again, going back between the contrast of like evil industrialism and organic natural life. I mean, it couldn't be more clear. It's like metal versus trees. And so such an impactful number of scenes with the Ents, and boy, do they do a good job at wrecking Isengard. It's so fun to watch every time.
Yeah, I think if it didn't have the payoff, the Ent mode stuff, it's like a little frustrating. I think it was more so when I was younger, because they kept cutting away from like Helm's Deep, which I thought was just like the coolest thing in the world. And I was like, stop going back to these freaking trees, which aren't trees. And they're like, even though he's like, I'm no tree, but my name's Treebeard. Don't worry about it.
Right.
But you're like, oh man, they're cutting back to this. And like you get the joke in there, and it's funny because like now that I've started to see like the bigger picture a little more, and like I started to notice things where I see like the designs of the other trees, they're almost like cartoonish. Like it's almost comical.
Yeah.
Like some of them are just kind of like weird warped faces, but they're kind of like when Treebeard turns around, he's like, "We decided you're not orcs." The ones in the back are like they nod.
They're like, yeah, I think we feel good about this
they're like
decision.
great stuff. I was wondering too if this. I don't think it's a commentary on this, but I kind of thought maybe this was like a dig at like democracy or something, where they're like, all right, there's all these people that come together and it takes forever to decide anything. And if they ever decide on one thing, it's going to be something that's like really, inane or whatever. Not to make the show political, but I was like, what if that was like a little kind of like, and there's, Mary who's like, we got to go. Like, we got to do something. Yeah. And the kind of, I think this might be one of the bigger turning points, not, like for him, he's kind of gotten it for a while. Like he loves, I think, the Shire maybe more than almost anybody because he talks about it so much.
Yeah.
And then, but for Pippin, who has been this kind of like, he's this kind of bumbling idiot this whole time. But when he takes a moment, he's like, what if I was just kind of clever? And he's like, you know what? I got an idea. Treebeard, take us south. He's like, and Treebeard's like, that's going to lead you past Isengard. He's like, yes, but the closer we are to danger, the farther we are from harm. Right. And Treebeard's, his rationale is he's like, well, I don't know if that makes sense, but you are very small. And I don't know if he means that like you're small so you can sneak past, or you're small and you must have a different perspective of the world. Right. Like, I love that. It's just so like, it's so endearing. It's so like grandpa doesn't get it. And then, like you said, that moment too, when and Treebeard's got this kind of thing where there's so much that's gone on. Like they lost the Entwives. He's like, we just don't know where they are, which is kind of sad, but like, it's kind of funny. Right. And then he's giving this little like talk about stuff. And then he like walks out and then you see like the destruction and you're like right there. It's so cool. Cause I could take a shot of just him standing there amongst the trees without anybody saying anything. Yeah. And you'd be like, uh-oh. Like, you'd be like, there's something, there's something wrong here. And I like that even though it takes them so long to say anything in Entish, and they don't say anything unless it's worth taking a long time to say, he just bellows. And all the other trees are like, all right. And they're like, it's not even, it's just like, is he just like, war? He's like, we're going time to kill. And you're like,
and they're like, oh, we're doing it? All right, we're doing it. Let's go.
Yeah, and that whole sequence, I was watching it again, and a lot of people kind of point to that sequence in this film. And when they're all walking, he talks about the last march of the Ents, and the music swells. And I said out loud the other night, I was just like, "This movie's magic." And I shouldn't acknowledge that it's a movie, but I was like, "This is just magic." I was like, "It's a bunch of these guys are gonna go fight," and it's so good because like there's Saruman, who you think is like this unassailable, scary force, but he's completely, as they said, they've unleashed Isengard. It's been emptied, and so everybody who's there are just like the construction workers.
Exactly.
And so they're like, oh, we are not prepared for this, which is great. But it's also cool because they can't, like the trees, or I would say the Ents can't go knock down Orthanc. They can't just like go over there and be like, push it over. They like throw a few rocks at it. I was gonna ask.
Well, I just want to mention there's so many really good lines. I pulled up one of them. It's when Treebeard actually has Merry and Pippin in his hands. And Mary says, we're not orcs, we're hobbits. And Treebeard says, hobbits? Never heard of hobbit before. Sounds like orc mischief to me. They come with fire. They come with axes, gnawing, biting, breaking, hacking, burning. Destroyers and usurpers, curse them. Like there is something like so like visceral about the anger that he has there. And again, testament to Davies for doing such a good job with that voice. But, it's like almost Shakespearean. Like it's just like, it's like a little poem almost where it just comes from his soul, and that he's like, oh man, orcs, I don't do orcs, you know what I mean? And so like that sets the stage for the scene that you mentioned when he goes out and he actually sees all the destruction, and he's like, yeah, this is exactly what they do, and I'm done with it, let's go. And the March of the Ents is amazing. Such a great scene.
Yeah, and that's maybe one of the reasons why he kills that orc like outright, because he has that and he's like, that's an orc, I'm gonna kill you. Like it's not like a question. Like Merry and Pippin, he's kind of like, maybe, but like that kind of. And I was gonna mention this later on too. This movie feels like it's more poetic than any of the others in just speech. The way that people talk, I'm just like, you're like, people don't talk like this normally, and even in these movies, it seems a little off. But like, they really, there's so much that's, and it comes more so with Rohan and all that, but even like that little point they make there, or even Sam, like, as his is more of a sing song where he's like, his
he's
speech,
like a bard.
He's like a bard, and then sometimes
Yeah.
he's like talking about potatoes. He's like, boil them, mash them, stick them in a stew.
Yeah.
And you're like, what?
Yeah.
What?
And the
But
scene
yeah,
of when the Ents are destroying Isengard is so great. And there's like
yeah,
little bits of humor in there too. There's a part of the scene where one of the trees, like his head catches fire and he's like kind of running around and he like dunks it in the water to put it out. Like there's just these little slices of humor and that, it feels good to get a win in the middle of all that horror. And so you're seeing the scene of all the Ents just trashing Isengard and breaking these machines and drowning all of these construction workers and like then you get like a little bit of humor and like I was like clapping and laughing. Like it was just like I'm like, this is great, get
yeah,
them,
yeah.
like it just feels so good to get a win. And if you can, mix some humor in there, it feels even better.
Yeah, well, and it's like you almost start to feel not like bad for the orcs, but like they'll catch one on fire and then it'll put itself out. They're like, there's one they pull down and they all jump on and start like hitting it with axes, but then Trigger
Yeah.
throws like a huge boulder. Boulder perfectly goes up over, crushes all of them, and you're like,
Yeah.
the ones who are like, we got this, oh, and they're gone.
Yeah,
It's just
exactly.
like, oh, and then
It's
there's
almost like slapstick
it
almost.
is.
Like it's
Well,
just like a wacky scene.
yeah, and Merry and Pippin are like throwing rocks and they're like
Yeah.
dropping orcs from like a great distance.
Yeah.
And like
They're
Trigger's like,
NFL
got him.
quarterbacks.
Yeah, it's like it's so good. Okay, you might be able to explain this to me. Is there a reason why Saruman doesn't do anything? Like, has he lost that power because of the resurrection of Gandalf?
It's interesting. Both Gandalf and Saruman are. There's like a whole. If you have read the Silmarillion, if you thought the regular trilogy is challenging to read, the Silmarillion is like the trilogy on steroids. It's like written almost like the Bible. Like it can be very dry and difficult to understand, but the sort of origin story of the essentially wizards. We can talk more about it when we talk about Gandalf and his return. Spoilers.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily that he's lost the power. He's just super deflated. And he's seeing essentially all this destruction from his ivory tower. And he's unable to do anything because, really the only scene where you see him fight is with Gandalf and the Fellowship.
Yeah.
And where you see him like pick up a sword, or I guess a staff, and knock some heads. And so it's not necessarily that he doesn't have power. It's just that he realizes that his power is useless in this sort of setting. And so he sees his framework, his infrastructure of evil just being decimated. And because he's been using everyone else as a pawn, he's been using the orcs, the construction workers, the Uruk-hai, and Gollum, etc., as his arm, as his sort of mechanism. Without that, it's totally useless, right? It's like if you, it's like when Gandalf goes into Rohan and he's like, "Oh, you wouldn't take my walking stick, would you?" It's like, well, yeah, he says that because without his walking stick, he's not as powerful. So it's a similar dynamic where it's like without that infrastructure of essentially his underlings running that show, his power is greatly lessened. Yeah,
Sure. Yeah. Well, and his casting time on spells takes a while too. I mean, he has to get to the top of the tower. He's got a chant
it's
for
a
a bit.
whole thing.
Gets a lightning strike, maybe. Like
Yeah,
it's not
he's
going to be
lightning.
direct hit. So it's like he's like, I can't. How am I supposed to get up there?
He's not as young as he once was.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's all I really want is like in this movie. Just show me the elevator system because there's a lot of times where the top of
Right.
Orthanc, I'm like, how did you get up there? But I enjoy that a lot. It's just so funny. A lot of the games they have him have like a fireball, and I always think I'm like, is this like he like shoots one? I think in Return of the King, the extended stuff, but like in this one, they're like, nah, he's just gonna be like he on his little. He's like, what's happening?
Yeah.
He's like,
I think it's like it's more of like an emotional defeat, and I think
Yeah.
it's like a hypothetical or not a hypothetical, a figurative defeat where he's like, oh my god, they broke my machines. Oh my god, they're drowned. They broke the dam.
Yeah,
oh god, I really needed that dam.
Yeah, which I think I don't know if that's extended as well, but there's a moment where he's talking to like one of his orc foremen and he kind of says to him, he's like, you know what, let's go after Fangorn. But then he also, it might be in the regular version too, but he says, he's like, dam up the river. And that is so much better with that knowledge. And again, this could be in the regular one too, but like going back to that and they're releasing the river and you're like, oh, because Saruman said at one moment, he's like, yeah. He's like, all right, so trash the forest, dam up the river, kind of do whatever was necessary to make this happen. And then it's just kind of like, oh no. And then like it's even worse on top of it because like Helm's Deep doesn't go the way he wants it to.
Right.
And it's like,
Yeah.
but yeah, that whole sequence is great and it's such a good payoff. And you get Merry and
Totally.
Pippin, who gets some food and some other stuff, which they
Yeah.
definitely cut out of the main version.
For sure.
They're like,
For sure.
we're not going to use it, which is funny because I was thinking, like, did the Uruk-hai raid this? And they like
Right.
brought it, like, the nice
took it
food
with them.
back somewhere, and they were like, "Yeah, we hate apples. We don't want this stuff." And Saruman's like, "That's my private supply of apples."
Yeah,
Like, you know,
exactly.
or like, I don't think Saruman. Maybe it'd be great if Saruman actually loved Longbottom Leaf, but he also chastised Gandalf in Fellowship for loving it. He's like, your love of the the halfling's pipe weed is like addled your brain, and it's
but
like,
he like does it on the side.
Yeah, exactly. He's like, I just don't do it when I'm making bombs. It's just two different. You got to separate them out.
Yeah.
But let's get into the thing that I think, like, a lot of people kind of come back to for Two Towers, and that's kind of the trio, which obviously expands a bit. But we've got our boys Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli running for days on end, who have not given up.
So much running.
So much running, and I love that you always get the wide shots or these aerial shots of like Aragorn and Legolas kind of vying for lead, but Gimli is always in the back. There's never like a Gimli in front, like going, like he's just, he can't keep up.
Very effective over short distances.
Yeah, they're natural sprinters, which is great. But I love the thought that the Uruk-hai, and I guess this kind of gives credence to later on when they kind of abandon Helm's Deep, because you don't really get the sense that they're cowards, but there's this kind of sense that like they're trying to get this thing back to their master for sure. But there's also this a little bit of fear. Like there's this kind of like think of like the best special ops units today, and they're hunting you, and they will never give up hunting you, and they're just running you down, and you're just like, we can't outrun these guys. And there's so many of us, but if we turn around, do you remember what they did to our guys when we first attacked? They like decimated us. We got one of them, and they're like, we just can't. It's like, oh my gosh. But I love that whole chase thing. Again, it's very like, you do it forever, right? But they do it in such a way where it's fun. It's like Aragorn's tracking, like you get, that's kind of like his intro, and Legolas is just like watching them and stuff, and Gimli's just like trying to keep up. And that moment when they finally do catch up, which is more so with the Rohirrim and Eomer and all that stuff, and then you get brought into the politics of Rohan, which is so great. I love. Speaking of people who are just great actors, just Karl Urban, who people, I think,
phenomenal.
Maybe one of the most underrated gems anywhere. Karl Urban is, I love him so much, but that exchange between, it's so funny too, because you have like, it's a man, it's an elf, and a dwarf, and all these men kind of circle up around him, and the first thing they do is they're all pointing spears at him. It's not like, hey, it's another guy, we should be buddies. It's like, I'm watching you, buddy. Like, I don't trust anybody.
It's like, Saruman, he like, I forget how he phrases it, but he's essentially like, you could be evil. Like, Saruman has his magical ways. Like, he can make any of us evil. Like, we don't know for sure. And then there's that little, there's the back and forth between Gimli and Eomer. And he's like, I would take your head off if it stood but a little, higher off the ground or something. And then Legolas is like, oh, you want to mess with my boy? And you're like, oh, that's adorable. I love the dialogue that happens there with like Aragorn being like, look, no, we're good. This is our sort of thing. We're tracking these two hobbits. And Eomer's like, we killed everything and everyone. So we're really sorry. Here's a horse. But he's like, they banished us from Rohan. Wormtongue is like, manipulating Theoden. And he's that one line where he's like, don't trust a hope, it is forsaking these lands.
I love
it's such a good line. And it's just like, even it kind of has this vibe of like every man for himself. He's like, we've been banished, but like, good luck to you. We won't hold you down any longer. Here's a horse, but like, just keep an eye out. We're all screwed here. Okay. Just like, look out for yourself kind of thing. And then they move on. But like the Rohirrim are so cool. And just like, their natural ability to like, have use horses so effectively, and like it's that like organic talents where it's like, no, we're horse guys, we're the horse people. Okay. That scene is awesome. And of course, like, the realization that Legolas, Gimli, and Aragorn have when they realize that Merry and Pippin might be dead, they're like, you just see the wind completely fall out of their sails. And then of course the scene when they go to where that fight took place, the scene where Aragorn kicks the helmet. The story is that what's his name?
Viggo Mortensen.
Vigo. I almost said Hugo Martin, but that's a different person.
Yeah.
Viggo Mortensen, when he kicks the helmet, apparently he broke his toe when he
Yeah.
did that. And so his scream was a real one, and they kept it, and it's perfect.
Yeah. Oh, it's
Um,
so good.
yeah.
I also love that we get like a little bit of that Peter Jackson kind of like horror thing, or maybe it's more of like an orc or Uruk-hai thing where they're like the first thing we see is like a head on a pike, but it's like this tongue that's all like like
Yeah.
it's like they did it
Yeah.
like in a very specific way, and there's all these bodies burning.
Yep.
But yeah, it's so great too that like the Rohirrim is like, you know what? We're loyal to Theoden, but things aren't going well right now, so we're just gonna be, I don't know, kind of cruising around Rohan. If we see
Yeah.
anything, we'll just take it out. Like we
Yeah.
kind of don't have a home right now, but we're still gonna defend the borders. It's
Exactly.
like, yeah, man, I just, Éomer, and I guess talking about him and Faramir now, it kind of gives me this hope. Like this one is a little more hopeful towards men in some
Yep.
respects because it's like, hey, there's still some quality people. They're not, unfortunately, they're not the people leading everyone right now.
Right.
Because
right.
even Theoden has his faults, but like you kind of wish that Éomer was, because he seems like a pretty chill dude if you talk to him for a second.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's that harkening back to what you said with the Legolas, like drawing a bow and like point blank, like he's like,
Yeah.
I'm gonna shoot you in the face, and Gimli, like, and this whole time Gimli's been like, freaking elves, and
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
and it's so funny because then like in the Hobbit trilogy they make Legolas like super racist, which is
Right.
it's so funny. It's like there's 50 years there where Legolas is like, you know what, maybe dwarves aren't just so
Yeah.
bad.
I
Like,
think I'm learning. I think I'm
come
changing my
around.
ways. Yeah.
But yeah, that whole sequence, and I love that there's like this little detective. It's like a chase movie for a bit, and then it goes into detective mode where it's like Aragorn. This guy isn't just like just one of the men who's been around for a while, and he's like a longer life because he's doing a day. But like he's a skilled dude. Like he's like oh my gosh, all hope is gone. And then that's kind of like the theme of these movies, which I love so much. Is like hope is never truly gone. But he like looks around and he's like, okay, so let's just play it out. 2 hobbits lay here and they were bound. And then like that kind of that whole sequence of like back and forth, and it's like
cut and
and he's like, oh my, he's like, they can still be alive. Which is so good. And then those guys going in there and Gimli walking around with an axe and he's like looking at all the trees. He's like
lower your axe.
He's like lower, put your axe down. Which I swear sometimes Gimli in this one, I think he's got all the axes he has. I don't remember him having I don't know if it's the double-sided. There's one axe I feel like he didn't have in Fellowship, or he wasn't showing it off, and now he's got that one. And I was like, he looks great. I love Gimli.
So great.
And for some odd reason, they give him a leap ability in the RTS games, even though he's not good at jumping.
That's so funny.
It's very funny. But I love the moment where it's like they've been tracking. They're like, okay, we've lost. Oh, there's more hope. And then they like get into Fangorn after talking to Éomer, and Éomer's like, the white wizards around here. And I love the way they describe magic. I always call the magic in Lord of the Rings more like folklore, old or elder magic. Because he's like, he walks here and there, they say. What a weird thing to say, but it's still so indicative of like what a wizard would do. You'd be like, oh, he's like
definitely
like
like, is he here or is he there? That's scary. Tell me more, please.
It's confusing. And then you hear all this and you're like, oh man, this guy, he's been such a thorn in our side. And then Legolas is like, the white wizard is like approaching, and Aragorn's like, okay, here's the deal, guys. We're gonna we'll try to bring him down in like a second. All right, just like no holds barred, kill him. And that whole reveal, again, unfortunately the trailer kind of shows it, but I love that they manipulate you because you see like him from the shoulder with Merry and Pippin, but then also they manipulate, they take Saruman's voice and Gandalf's voice and they kind of mix them together. And you're like,
man, that scene is just I love that scene so much. My older brother, I must have been 11 or 12 when I remember him coming home with a VHS of the Fellowship, and then it was like nowhere to go but up. I just became obsessed. And I remember clear as day watching the Two Towers with him, and he was watching me watch that scene. And my jaw hit the floor. Like it was just, it's one of my absolute favorite reveals. I think it might be my favorite reveal of all time.
It's so good.
And I remember when my little sister was, I don't know, she must have been like 15 or 16, maybe a little bit younger, probably around the same age I was when I saw it. I did the same thing. I was like, we're going to watch these movies. So we watched The Fellowship, and then the next day we watched The Two Towers. And so it was fresh. The pain of losing Gandalf was very fresh in her mind. And I don't know if I may have been like do you think you know who the White Wizard is? And she's like, yeah, it's like Saruman. I was like, oh yeah, wow, scary. Ooh, yeah, totally. And then I watched her watch that scene, and it was the exact same reaction. And I'm just like, man, this is the coolest passing of the torch I've ever done in my
Dude,
life.
that's so cool. That
Yeah,
is
and so
very
like
good.
just the reveal, when that glow lessens and you see who, they turn around, Aragorn or Legolas shoots an arrow, and it's like kind of ricocheted away, and then um, Aragorn's sword like burns his hand, so he drops it, and they're like, "Oh, our plan, we're screwed." And then you realize it's Gandalf, and he had come back as the White Wizard. Like, man, I can't even explain the emotions that come through you when you see that scene.
Oh yeah.
And it's just and that's when you connect the dots, and that's when he tells his story. And he's like, "This is what happened. I fought the Balrog, and I smote him on the ruin of this mountain, and then I lived through eons and eternities and lifetimes and all that, and then you're just like, God, you've gone through so much." And he's like, "I come to you now at the turn of the tide. Let's do this, guys. Like let's go win. Let's get that W."
Dude, that's such a great way of putting it. I It is such an impactful scene, and it's one of also the very few Gimli axe throws you get in all the trilogies. But I love how they also tease it that it's different because we've seen Saruman plenty in this movie, and he's got his black staff, but like they show you in little bits and pieces, especially in that moment, but also before that, I think you see it's a white staff.
Yeah.
And so, but like you're not, as a viewer, you see long white hair, robe of like white, and you're like, that can only be Saruman. Like there's nobody else. It's like, it's not Galadriel. It's not like somebody who's like showing up. It's like, and him like talking in a weird way. He's like, we found these two hobbits and they saw someone they didn't expect. And they're all thinking, we're about to die. We've got a villain who's monologuing. He just basically disarmed us like it was nothing. And he's going to kill all of us. And then he steps forward, and I love it because I think Legolas does it. I think Gimli might too. They both like kneel like right away, like Legolas does. And Aragorn, like still in disbelief, he's like, you fell. He's like, I don't know what.
Right.
I can't even, what? Like, he's like, I've been around for a while, right? I've never seen anything like this. Like, it's just like he can't, it's like his brain is broken. And I love that because there's this moment where they're kind of talking to him. They're like, Gandalf. And he's like, yeah, that's what they used to call me. He's like, Gandalf the Grey. Yeah. And then he's like, I'm Gandalf the White. And he's like, I'm haughty, I'm superior, I'm Gandalf the White. I am not Gandalf the Grey. Gandalf the Grey was kind of fun and you could chill with him. No, I've got business. But as a kid, I remember being confused when he talked about his past. Because I was like, okay, so they fell into the water and that somehow teleported them to the top of a mountain. But he's like, I fought the Balrog for like 4 days up a mountain. I'm like, you fought him up a mountainside? Like, you fought up a mountainside and you got to the top and that's when he died? Like, no wonder Gandalf was like, man, this is freaking ridiculous. Like, he lays down, he's like, oh, you gotta be kidding me.
I'm so tired.
He's like, oh, it's so intense. I love that was like his level up, though. Like, he's like, you beat the Balrog, and they're like, and now you're stronger. And that kind of, his talk there with them saying, he's like, he's like, I am Saruman. And he's like, or rather, what Saruman should be. And it's like almost like
Saruman as he should have been.
Yeah, like the gods of this world are kind of like, well, we sent one of these guys and it didn't go so well, so we're gonna send you back because you seem like you earned it, buddy. And I love it. I love it so much.
And there's a really cool Easter egg. I don't know if you're aware of this. In Gandalf the Grey's staff, right, is like the brown wooden staff with kind of like the, I don't know, oak top.
Yeah.
Inside of that staff, look at pictures. You see Gandalf the White staff inside of the top of his staff.
Whoa, really? Yeah. That's nuts.
So his white staff has this really elegant, almost elven kind of like braided wood pattern. You see it clear as day inside of his staff all of the time.
Really? So that's in the Gandalf. That's in the Gandalf the Grey. That's in the crystal.
Yep.
That's nuts.
So like there's kind of like a cage of like, brown wood holding that crystal up. Inside of that cage, you see the pattern of the white staff inside.
Which I know people ask me about this with Fellowship. So Gandalf's able to make staffs too, because they're like, oh, like his staff got stolen or whatever. It's like he can make another. Right. Like it's not like but like I think we're also trained like lightsaber style. You're like, well, wait a second, how did he get another lightsaber? Like you're like, you just find that on the ground. That's so cool. I didn't know that. I also
really tiny little Easter egg. Yeah.
I love that magic too. And I feel like maybe that's because he was like not the high rank wizard he becomes, but like later on you see in Return of the King, he can like shoot a beam of light. But like in Fellowship, he's like, so you take the crystal, you put it in the staff and you go, and you're like, I got a little
Right.
torch. Like
And
it's
he's
like
like, nice little sconce on my staff.
he's
Yeah.
like, look at this, and everybody's like,
Yeah.
that's pretty nice. Like
Yeah. And
um,
so the
so good.
story of sort of Gandalf and Saruman as well. This goes back like way origin of like Middle Earth. There was like the god of all of Middle Earth who kind of created it. It was this being called Eru Ilúvatar, and Eru Ilúvatar essentially sang a song, and that song was the creation of Middle Earth. And so different parts of the song created different parts of Middle Earth. And he essentially had their kind of two sets of sub gods. They were the Maiar and the Valar. Gandalf and Saruman, I think they're both Valar, if I'm not mistaken. Right. And essentially the story is like they were singing the song, and Morgoth, who was one of the Maiar, if I'm not mistaken, started singing off key. And because he was mad, he wanted more power, and essentially he started singing off key, and then he essentially turned into Sauron. And so if you think of Gandalf less as a wizard and more as like this kind of angelic god, they were sent to Earth to guide the race of men, and they took on the form of old men to essentially be less intimidating, because if they came in their true form, it would just blow minds and everyone would die because they're so fantastic or whatever.
Yeah.
So if you think of Gandalf as this kind of like being that flows in and out of, like this corporeal form, the fact that he like essentially died or, napped, if you will, from exhaustion, and then came back as this more powerful being, it starts to make a little bit more sense, because I think the first time I saw it, I was like, I don't get it. He just comes back as a different wizard and he's stronger. Like, what's the move there? But if you think of him less as like just like an old wizard in the traditional kind of historical sense, rather think of him as this like being, this godly being, that transition to come back, and he says, I have to finish my task. I have to continue to help this group of people. It totally reframes his resurgence, and it makes it a little bit more, I guess, palatable.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's thank you, because that provides that context. And I've tried to research a little bit. And for people who are like, wait a sec, Manny just threw some words around and some names I don't understand. Don't worry. Lord of the Rings likes to give 3 names to everybody, so don't worry about that.
Everyone has lots of names.
Remember, it's Nazgul, Ringwraiths, Black Riders. See, look at that. It's all the same thing.
Yeah.
Or they are the same thing. But he's talking, the differences here, and we're talking about the Balrog earlier, a Balrog of Morgoth. Like, and you're like, okay, wait a sec. So Morgoth, one of the like the big bad, who's like let's just say he was the Sidious to Sauron's Vader a little bit. Like, he was kind of like the big bad. And I don't remember if the Balrog is the Balrog also a Maiar.
I don't think so. I'm actually looking now. There is a series of YouTube videos, and I will find the link before we're done here. But there's a specific guy whose name I'm totally forgetting. But there's a specific guy who goes super deep into Lord of the Rings lore. And he has a whole episode on the Balrog, and it's super fascinating. Cool. And I completely forget most of it, but I'll find the link before we're done, and I'll be sure to mention it before we wrap up, so people can check it out. Because if they want to learn more, this guy's like a scholar, just an absolute beast with Lord of the Rings stuff.
Yeah, that's kind of stuff that you need full videos on, because we could not describe it probably well enough. But also think of Sauron as being one of these kind of like demonic or devilish forces to kind of be against the angelic forces. So that way, there are power levels and stuff, even though sometimes you can kind of supersede them and work around them, as we've seen with Gandalf, because he's like, you know what? I'm not done, baby. I'm back, and I'm better than ever, even though, again, I like Gandalf the Grey. I feel like Gandalf the Grey is like a guy you'd have a meal with. I feel like Gandalf the White's like you'd have like a meeting with, and you'd be like, oh my gosh, you're gonna be Gandalf the White? And you're like, I know, I'm really nervous. Gandalf, and kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but I was tearing up again, and even though it doesn't maybe look as good as it did, back in the day, but the charge of the Rohirrim down in Helm's Deep, and Gandalf just shows up, white horse, Shadowfax, the Lord of Horses,
of Horses,
which you're like, again, if he's been sleeping or doing stuff for aeons, he could have had a bunch of like adventures with this friend, because this is the first time that like Aragorn and Legolas are like, you could summon like a super horse, and they're like, when did you get that? He's like, I've been buddies with him for a long time. And they're like, oh, yep, dude, you're back. I don't care. But I love seeing Shadowfax up against the hill, or on the top of the hill, and you're like, oh my gosh, and there's Gandalf, he's like, King Theoden is alone, and then Aragorn shows up, he's like, not alone, and then the horses all show up, and you're like,
And you're like, oh
holy,
my
like,
God.
you're like,
Yeah.
it's like,
Yeah.
I was crying, man. I was like, here we go. I was like, it's
Oh,
beautiful. I was
totally.
like, it's beautiful. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
They're coming to save the king. It's like, I love it. It's so impactful. And I think the charge is still really good in Return of the King, but this one is just like it's like these movies kind of have to, not Deus Ex Machina a little bit, but there's like, it's so much better to have these big, beautiful moments, or like additions where it's like the elves show up at Helm's Deep. And I don't think that normally, I don't think that happened in the book, but like that is such a fun, like
Yeah.
little, like moment. It's kind of weird that like Elrond told one of like Galadriel's buddies to be, he's like, you best get over help those boys. But again, it's okay. There was a whole like Arwen was gonna be in the Battle of Helm's Deep and she was cut and all this stuff, and Eowyn was gonna have a fight scene and stuff. But
I actually just found the link. The YouTube channel is called Hello Future Me. He has a 23 video playlist, all of Lord of the Rings, and one of them is What Are Barlogs Explained.
Oh, cool.
Super fascinating stuff. So if you really want to get into like the lore and the origin stories of all this stuff, this guy is really incredible.
Got it. Hello Future Me. Check him out. Beyond. Let's go support that. That sounds great. Now it's like, now it's homework. See, if only classes were like that back in like, in high school and stuff. Like, do you want to take a Lord of the Rings class? Like, whatever, you just want to watch YouTube videos about all day. We'll just ask you questions about it later. Like, you're like, yes, I know quite a bit about this now, this fictional world that this man created in World War I. You're like, but I got it. That's it's so cool. But anyway, so Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, that trio here, which Legolas and Gimli are more kind of the comedic, the effect. They're fun, the relief there. But Aragorn, I feel like you're starting to see more acceptance here, because the end of Fellowship, he's passed the test. He's like, I don't know why exactly he doesn't decide to go with Frodo at that moment, but I love his whole, he's like, I would have gone with you, all the way to Mount Doom. And like, it, like, it's very sincere, but he kind of is like, you got to do this yourself. But this movie kind of shows like his resolve to help man, and then also like what it is to not do when it comes to being a king. Because like you get Theoden, who is this kind of like gruff, like he's kind of like, it's my way or the highway, and he's like, he's like, call for aid. Like, I'm not gonna call for aid. Gondor sucks, and it's like, we're all gonna die, and you're not gonna try. Like, and he's like, nope, whatever. And I just love that like Aragorn's kind of, he's the voice of reason, and he's been around longer, and he's just kind of like, oh man, like he's like, Theoden says that line. He's like, I thought last time I checked, Theoden was king of Rohan, not Aragorn. And Aragorn's like, all right, buddy. He's like, you got problems, I get it.
And it's Aragorn is such a good counter to so many other characters. He's like, if you compare him to Boromir, right? They're both men, but Aragorn is like, he's like so cultured, he's like in love with this elf, and so he has this, like, he has so much knowledge of the elven world, and he can speak their languages, and he understands the culture and the sort of social norms of that world. And he's obviously super skilled as a ranger and in combat and all these things. And so he brings this level-headedness to so many different characters, whether it's, Legolas kind of like losing his stuff right before the Battle of Helm's Deep, where he was like, all these people are going to die. Why are we even trying? And then Aragorn is like, dude, have some hope, man. Like, relax, dude, in his own language nonetheless. Right. So he brings a level-headedness to so many different characters that desperately need it. Now, usually, like 8 times out of 10, they reject that level-headedness because they're stubborn or they're passionate about something or what have you. But he's just a good counter. He's kind of like the guy that keeps everybody in check, including himself. He, for better or for worse, he's scared of his rightful place. He's scared of his rightful place as the king. He's scared of falling in love with Eowyn, right? I'm sorry, Arwen. And so, he has these reservations about so much, but I think that's what makes his character good in the end, is that he doesn't play by emotions. He doesn't necessarily play on instinct or knee-jerk reactions. He thinks things out because he's had so much experience. He's had so much knowledge and exposure.
Oh yeah, totally. And I love that eventually he kind of succumbs to being like more emotional and kind of realizing that he can take up his rightful place and not be like his forefathers, because that's like his big, like this looming shadow of generations past, where he's like,
Right.
my whole family kind of doomed the world in a way. And
Exactly.
I do love that this movie also is very romantic. Like there's so much romance in
Super
this movie
romantic.
for something that's not happening always in the present. Like there's the Eowyn kind of subplot there where she obviously is like, it's nice to have one guy around. He's a good looking guy, first off,
Right.
and second off, he's not like the worst dude ever, because like it seems like in Rohan for a while it was like, okay, so Grima is constantly tailing her, and it's like
Right.
super weird. Her uncle, who is basically her father figure, has become this like decrepit, weird, creepy man
Yeah.
who just
Yeah.
says weird little things here and there. Her
Right.
like her cousin died, her brother has been like banished, and it's just like,
Yep.
oh
The
man,
bar
like
pretty low.
it's like, yeah, so she's just like, oh, and then Aragorn shows up and she's like, oh my gosh, and it's some guy who takes her seriously, like with a sword.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
he's like, oh, that's pretty good. And
Yeah.
she's just like, she like looks, the way she looks at him when they kind of meet with the sword and the dagger, she's like, oh my gosh, should I be like, uh-oh, like, and he's
Yeah.
kind of like, how you doing? He's like,
Yeah.
oh, this is pretty cool.
And like you do feel bad for her, right? Because
Yeah.
you know in the end that his heart doesn't belong to her. But for better or for worse, he totally sees her as a peer and as a strong woman. And I think to your point about having just a bunch of not the best men in her life, it probably feels great for her. And I think, hope is, to your point earlier, it's hope is never fully lost. And that's definitely so, so true. And this is one of those moments where it's like, he's giving her hope and he's giving her, he's recognizing her.
Mm-hmm.
And, but ultimately the hope for their relationship, it doesn't really exist as far as he's concerned. And it is tragic, but, I think it ultimately sets her up well for, her awesome scene, where she gets to be the big, the big bad, rather defeat the big bad. But, her character is so interesting because she comes from, again, a race of like horse people, the salt of the earth, like horse riders. And pairing her with Aragorn, albeit for only a few scenes, it was so impactful. It was really great to watch.
Oh my gosh, yeah, and I love that there's that kind of juxtaposition where she'll have to say like, hey, like, where's that the woman who gave you that jewel? And he just like kind of looks off, and they almost could be like the harps going, and they could be like, it's like a dream sequence or something, but they don't. It just hard cuts back to like his kind of time with Arwen. There's that little moment right before he leaves in Fellowship that they kind of jump back to. They don't show you in Fellowship, which they could have, where he's leaving and she's like, hey, like, you're just gonna like slip away in the morning and not say bye or anything? And he's like, yeah, I'm not coming back. And she's like, you underestimate yourself in battle. She's like, you'll come back. And he's like, that's not what I'm talking about. And there's kind of like this breakup that like clearly he doesn't want, she doesn't want. And she's like, yeah, how about you keep that? Because he's like, you should take this back. Like, you should take the Even Star back. You should, like, this is like part of who you are. And like, I don't want you to like suffer because of me. And she's like, it was a gift. Like, get out of here. But he's still like constantly thinking about her. And then there's like kind of that connection she has to him and to kind of Middle Earth as a whole. And she kind of having that, like, where she's just like sitting in Rivendell, she's just like, oh my gosh, this is so sad. But she's having these moments where she's kind of almost like telepathically communicating with him through dream. And these little like jumps back to like him and Elrond together, like where Elrond's like, like Aragorn will say, she's gonna go, like she stays because she's got hope, which maybe to some degree, but then Elrond's like, no, she stays because of you, buddy. And it's like this kind of overly protective father who's like this street hooligan that his daughter brought home. He's like, oh my, I've been dealing with this guy for so long. It's like, get out of here.
He doesn't even shave. Come on.
Yeah, he's gonna get my daughter killed. He's like, she's got to get out of here. He's just like, I love the whole. He's like, you can go to the Undying Lands. You can bear your love to him for all time. Kind of again being that dad who's like, well, this will pass, but don't worry. Like things are gonna. It's just a phase, sweetie. And she's like, nope. I'm gonna stay here, and I love that. That's kind of it's threaded in, but it doesn't feel like it's out of nowhere. It's not like they're like, oh, we don't have any romance in this movie, and like Eowyn and Aragorn can't really have a thing. It's like, no, they put it in there, and so when it jumps back to Aragorn, he's like, actually, she's elf-kind, she's making for the Undying Land, and like right then, I think Eowyn, recognizing that Aragorn, it's not gonna work out, obviously, but like realizing that this guy he's not in a different league. It's just a different dude altogether. Like you learn
Sure.
that about him. You learn that he's 87. Like you find out
Yeah.
she's like, you rode to war with my grandfather, like stuff
He's
like
like,
that. You
yeah,
start to,
good memory. He was a toddler.
yeah,
So yeah.
yeah. Theoden was like, yeah, I recall this. It's like you start to get the sense that Aragorn, when you look at him, like a lot of characters in this movie, you look at him and you're like, you kind of make those snap judgments, and you're like, all right, we're in the same kind of arena, and like we there's so much we have in common. But then when you start
Yeah.
to really talk to him, you're like, uh-oh, like
Right.
this person's got perspective I can't even understand right
Totally.
now.
Yeah, there's
I
so much there. And
there's
like
oh,
his, going back to the kind of like father-son dynamic, he's looking at his ancestors and he's looking at his family and he's like, I don't want to make the same mistake they've made. I don't want this responsibility because ultimately they chose wrong and
yeah,
that blood is in my body. And so you see him deal with that in a major, major way. My favorite character forever was always Legolas. He was the coolest. He could skateboard on shields and shoot arrows and
yeah,
jump on elephants and all that. But I would say maybe like 10 years ago, I was like, man, Aragorn is just such an impactful character. And especially like as a human, not an elf, obviously, I'm like, I can relate to the things that he's challenged by to an extent. I've never, decapitated an orc with a sword, but
yeah, not yet.
not yet, at least.
Yeah,
There's hope is never lost.
exactly. It's always hope.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, like his character is really incredible, and especially through the third movie, The Return of the King is his movie. It's his
Yeah.
comeuppance, and so it's really, really interesting to see that essentially that final act of his story being set up so brilliantly in the Two Towers.
Yeah, and I love too that they kind of make him a leader that you can really not only like sympathize and empathize with for some of
Hmm.
us, but also you just like him, because unlike some leaders you get in movies where they're like, he's the leader, you've got to like him. And this one, it's like he'll sit down and he'll talk to a kid about his sword, and the kid's like freaking out on the night of battle, and he's like, this is a pretty good sword, and he's like, just don't
His
give
hair,
up,
you're like,
you
ah,
know.
you're
And
good.
you're like, oh my gosh. And they do this whole like, Legolas is like, your friends are with you, Aragorn, or Eowyn's like, they stay here not because they think they're going to win, it's because they love you and they would not be parted from you. Again,
Right.
very poetic, but there's this kind of like through line that people just love Aragorn because he is a good guy, and he legitimately is throughout these movies. And with
Yeah.
Theoden, there's so many times where Theoden kind of bullies back, and Aragorn could be like, you sit down. This is a bigger deal than you can possibly imagine.
Yeah.
And he's like, I've been in plenty of wars. Like, and Theoden kind of is like, I've seen plenty of wars. Like, you have, but you haven't seen as many as Aragorn. Aragorn
Yeah.
could be like, hey, you know what? Here's the deal. We're taking over. But he's like, you know what? No. This is your kingdom. You want to protect him. And he tells even Eowyn, he could have bullied that around and said, like, you know what? I'm making a snap judgment here, or I'm going to say, like, I think Eowyn should fight with us. He's like, it's not in my power to say if you should fight alongside us or not.
Right.
I can't make that call. Like, he's so
Yeah.
respectful of stuff, and that goes all the way back to the shards of Narsil. Like, it's
Yeah.
just, there's this respect in him all the time where he's just like, I'm just gonna be nice, I'm gonna be a good guy, even
Yeah.
though he could totally, like, he could defeat people in combat, he could bully people around and be like, I am the rightful king of all mankind, but he's
Right.
like, nope, nope,
And that's the thing,
not gonna do it.
he is that counter. He's the level-headedness that combats so many people's hot-headedness
Yeah,
or emotional headedness. And so I think just like he's just such a rock of the movie, and he balances out the dynamics, the character dynamics, the story dynamics in such a beautiful way. And I think if you like really learn about his origin story and what he went through, and you really learn about his sort of his story, all of that makes so much sense because you're like, wow, the perspective and the challenges that he's faced. It really just makes him the genuinely good, respectful, but also like super badass person that he is, right?
yeah. Well, and there's the dynamic too, like when you think he's lost or everybody thinks he is, it's like so detrimental to everybody. Like all the main characters
Yeah.
who know about that, they're all like, oh my gosh, like Legolas and Gimli specifically. It's like, man, we were like, there was 9 of us, and then there was like 3 of us. Now there's just the 2 of us, and like our leader is gone. And then like
Yeah.
he shows back up, and Gimli's all just like, bless you, laddie. And Aragorn's like, I can't really talk right now. Kind of gives him like a pat on the shoulder. He's like,
Yeah.
good to see you too, pal. And then Legolas is just kind of like, where have you been, man?
Yeah.
And that exchange you brought up earlier, I love it. It's like all in Elvish. All the guys are down there, and they're talking about like Legolas is like, man, we're all screwed. And then out of nowhere, and obviously these regular Rohan soldiers and stuff aren't gonna understand this. Aragorn just screams out, "Well, then I will die as one of them." And
Yeah.
you're like, if he's saying that, you're like, uh oh. But
Yeah.
then kind of
Yeah.
Legolas kind of comes back around. He's like, hey, you've led us this far, and I'm sorry I despaired, and
Yeah.
I'm sorry about that. And it's nice to see that like some of these other characters, like you're getting more of this emotional niceness, as it were, out of Gimli. Like there's more of a vulnerability there, and then you're also starting to see the most chill guy almost in all the movies besides Aragorn, in that Legolas is like he's like unflappable. Like any fight
Yeah.
he's ready to do it. But like to have him finally be like, dude, this is ridiculous, we should get at it, like this is stupid,
Yeah.
this is dumb, and he's
Yep.
like, oh, okay, you know what, if you're cool, I'm gonna be
I'm
cool.
cool.
I'm
Yeah.
cool. And
There's a scene in the extended edition. It's called the Heir of Numenor, and it's a little conversation between Gandalf and Aragorn. I wanted to read a little bit from it, because they're kind of like looking into the mountains and they're seeing Mount Doom and they're seeing the fire grow bigger. And let's see here, blah blah blah. Okay, Gandalf says Sauron fears you, Aragorn. He fears what you may become, and so he'll strike hard and fast at the world of men. He will use his puppet Saruman to destroy Rohan. War is coming. Rohan must defend itself, and therein lies our first challenge. He then continues a little bit, and he says, but for all their cunning, we have one advantage. The ring remains hidden, and we should seek to destroy it. And that we should seek to destroy it has not yet entered their darkest dreams. And so it's this kind of, it's like a pep talk almost. It's like, hey man, like things are going pretty badly right now, and there's a lot going on. But we have two advantages. The ring is hidden, and they don't know that we want to destroy it. And also, we have you, and like what you, and he says it very specifically. He fears what you may become, right? He's like, if you choose to take that path and claim your rightful place, then like, that's a huge advantage. He fears that, and it's so funny because like you would think that Sauron doesn't fear men because he's beat them a number of times, right? And so for Aragorn to hear that so directly from Gandalf, again, someone else who has extremely impactful perspective and experience on in Middle Earth, to hear that straight from Gandalf was probably really important, and it ultimately again continues to set up the final film, the
yes,
third.
for sure. Like, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think, might be mistaken, I think that was at the very end of the Two Towers video game, and I remember seeing this, and it just cuts to Gandalf and Aragorn. He's like, Sauron and Saruman are tightening the noose.
The tightening
but,
noose, yeah.
But we have one advantage. And like he goes into that whole bit, and it's such a good little scene, but it does kind of, I can see where it's a little bit redundant, because Gandalf makes a similar speech after Helm's Deep, and they're all kind of looking out at it, and he's like, oh, the battle for Helm's Deep is over, the battle for Middle Earth is about to begin.
It's about to begin, yeah.
But you're totally right, and I love that, and that kind of leads a little more into the fact that like why when eventually we get Aragorn going to the Black Gate, that Sauron is like he can't look away. He's like, your dad's dad like messed me up, and I didn't think anybody could mess me up, but he did, and you're kind of here with your whole posse, and there may be a chance that you have a ghost army. I'm not exactly sure. So I could see where Sauron's like he can't look away, like
Right.
And it's so, I love movies like this, or I'll say characters like this, where it's always the ones who seem hesitant to have the power have the most. Like, I love, it's not like he's going to come in and he's like, I am, like if Boromir had this, he'd be like, I'm Boromir, I'm going to lead all men, I got a ghost army, let's do it. Like, Aragorn's like, I'm not really a fan of this. Like,
and the same with Frodo. He was so reluctant to start off on that journey.
Oh yeah.
And he's reluctant the entire time. And you're right, the people who are most reluctant about their power usually have the most. And that's a good thing. You know what I mean? Like, you need a level head to be like, man, I have this power. Let me really think about how I want to use it. Let me put my intentions in the right place. Whereas people like Boromir, like those kinds of people are impulsive and they're easily swayed. And so the power that they have, it's like a vanity metric. It's not a real measure of power. It's a fake power, and it's temporary.
Yeah, that's so well. Again, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a good little exchange, especially between the two of them, and to see their dynamic through this one and a little bit of Return of the King. Because one of the things I think that hurts me the most about this is you split up the Fellowship, and that makes it interesting. But at the same time, I just love the bonds that get formed, and I love watching these characters interact with each other.
Yeah.
But it's nice that like you get Gandalf and Pippin back together again in Return of the King, because there's been that kind of like from the beginning, even with Merry a little bit more so Pippin, where it's just like, Pippin, you suck, dude. He's like, you gotta get out of here. But I just love Gandalf and Aragorn talking to each other, and I love that they have this kind of like secret rapport where Gandalf will be
Right.
like, he's like, I'll be back in like 5 days. You look to the east, look at when the sun rises. I totally will be there. And like Gandalf
Yeah.
doesn't tell anybody else this.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
and so I'm sure Aragorn had a moment where he talked to Theoden and he's like, Gandalf went to go get some help,
Yeah.
and they'll be back, but we should ride out and meet them. And in that moment, Theoden's like, for death and glory, and you're like,
Yeah.
you idiot. And he's like, for Rohan, for your people. Like it's like
Yeah.
you're a king, and all you can think about is like, I'm gonna redeem myself, and I'm gonna go out there and die a glorious
Die a
death.
glorious
It's
death.
like,
Yeah,
and
man.
Aragorn's like, I don't even with this guy.
Yeah,
And
exactly. He's the
it's just,
level head. He's like, I cannot
he's like,
believe you just said that, but sure,
He's like,
whatever.
come on.
Let's just go.
He's like,
Yeah,
yeah, get the horses. And I just that whole sequence is so great.
it's incredible.
It's I mean the whole Helm's Deep thing, which some people say it goes on a little bit long, and we should probably talk about the battle sequences here. But
Sure.
let's start with Helm's Deep, even though I would typically start with the Warg stuff. Helm's
Yeah.
Deep, I think one of the most visually impressive. It's so iconic. It sticks in my mind when I think Lord of the Rings, the whole trilogy.
Definitely.
It's a battle that just like comes to mind right away.
Yeah.
And there's something about it where it obviously elevates the scope of what we had with Amon Hen, which is in Fellowship, but it
Mhm.
also isn't to the grand scale of Minas Tirith, where it's like I can't even comprehend how big this battle is.
Yeah.
Where it's like
Yeah.
10 times everything, the fortification and the army. But like this
Right.
is like you look at it and you're like you get a good feel. You get that there's kind of two main things going on. There's like the deeping wall and the causeway, and you're like, all right, this is kind of the defensive points, right?
Yeah.
And the way in which they kind of jump around to different moments, and there's I think more so in this fight than almost any other, there's these great little heroic moments where everybody
So many.
gets a good little thing, and some of them, like as far as like the main characters, they all get their moments, but they also maybe get two moments, and like
Yeah.
they're working together. There's like this kind of feeling that even though they're separate sometimes on the battlefield, that they're still working as one unit.
Right.
And it doesn't always work to their advantage. They can't just destroy everybody, but there's just such a coolness to it, and they probably didn't have to do it in dark and in the rain,
Right.
but they did, and it sounded
Yeah.
like it was miserable to shoot. But for goodness sakes, every time I watched that, because I used to watch it when it would come out, in December, 2001, 2002, 2003,
Yep.
and then like during Christmas time again, I always, when Helm's Deep comes up, I always get that Christmas vibe. I don't know
Oh,
why. I'm always
totally.
like, I was like, oh, it's kind of cold outside, and it's like, let's
Yeah.
get some cookies, let's watch some Helm's Deep. Like, there's
Yeah.
something so good and like meaty about Helm's Deep, and there's this kind of like, there's this despair, but then the elves show up, and it's like one of the
Yep.
few moments where Aragorn kind of oversteps. He walks in front of Theoden, and he basically hugs Haldir, and he's like, "You are most welcome." Like he's not going to give Theoden the chance to be like,
Yeah.
"We don't need no stinking elves." Like
Exactly.
and I
Yeah.
love that like the elves, it's like the elite units. They showed up, and it's like, "Oh, thank God."
Yeah. And then they're all like in uniform, like moving the exact same way, all in unison. It's just like, oh, this is gonna be so cool.
I just wish I'm like, you should have put those guys, like they should have been the first guys on the wall, which a lot of them are, but then
Yeah.
you should have been like, all right, when they started the ladders, I'd have been like, all right, pull the elves back. I'd have been like, make sure the great archers are like as safe as long as possible, but they're like the
Yep.
great fighters too, so they're on the wall and they're going.
Yeah.
But I also love the moment where Gimli knows a little Elvish because they say ladders, and he's like, good, and I was like, does Gimli know?
Yeah.
He's been picking up a little Elvish. I was
Rubbing
like,
off on him.
I was
Yeah.
like, look at that. But man, that fight. I mean, there's so much to talk about with it, but I love it so much. It might be one of my
Yeah.
favorite fight scenes in any movie ever.
I think
It's
it was
so good.
It was my favorite battle scene. I think it still stands in my head as my favorite battle scene, like sword and board kind of battle.
Yeah.
The only thing that overtook it was the final battle in Endgame. It's just so good.
Good call,
but,
good call.
but they're very different, apples
Yeah.
to oranges for sure. But I will say, I think meaty is a really good way of putting it because it is so pure. The combat and like the art of sword and board combat is so pure in this film, and I think I rewatched the first John Wick last
Ooh,
night,
good one.
and the fight choreography is amazing.
Yeah.
And for some reason they feel similar, and I think it's because of the fluidity of the choreography and like the darkness, and there's a lot of blacks and blues and like dark reds, and I think there's a lot of similar vibes in the sense that there's chaos going all the time. But to your point, like this unit is operating as a unit. You know what I mean? It's very choreographed. And the one shot when they're all waiting for the battles to begin and the lightning strikes above, and for a flash of a second you see the vastness of the of the army that they're about to face. And like I remember just being like, oh my God, what is about to happen? And just like the way everything takes off is so impactful. And to your point about like the scale, right? It's like in between Amonhen and Minas Tirith, it's like this perfectly sized battle. Like you get a good sense of scale, you get a good sense of the amount of power on each side. Like it feels like I'm watching like a professional RTS player,
Yeah.
like set up a battle and then click like play. Like it just felt really, really, really good. And everything from like the banter between Gimli and Legolas talking like, should I get you a box? And then they're counting their kills, and then the slickness of Legolas jumping on a shield and skateboarding down the stairs as he's taking people out. And they get knocked pretty good. Like there's a couple times where somebody will fall and then like Aragorn saves them at the last moment. And then of course, with the gunpowder being brought to that the one weak spot of the Deeping Wall. But and then they fight back, and there's all this. It's like the most intense tug of war, and it goes both ways so many times. And I think that's the sign of a good fight. It would be so boring, even with all the great choreography, if the good guys just wrecked house the entire time.
Totally. Yeah.
So it was good to see that back and forth, and I thought they did it really fairly.
Oh, for sure. And there's, like you said, kind of like Deeping Wall explodes, and you get like Aragorn's thrown down, and you're like, uh-oh, he's down. And then it's like Gimli with his crazy moment because he's just so happy to have his buddy back. Gimli's gonna jump and like land in the middle of these guys and start fighting, and all the archers are like waiting behind Aragorn. Aragorn's like, wait for it, and then like Gimli like gets knocked down, thankfully, and then Aragorn's like, just let him have it, guys. And then they all like Aragorn puts the sword up, runs in, and they do this quick cut where he like knocks a lance away or a spear away, and then they zoom in on like an elf that gets stabbed. I always thought when I was younger, like Aragorn for a second there, I was like, did Aragorn get like run through? I was like, but he's like fighting through there, and then like there's that kind of camaraderie where it's like, all right, Gimli, you and me, let's do some work. And then it's like they go to the causeway, and Theoden's like, hey, you guys give me as long as you can. And there's that great moment. That moment that I love. I know some people find it maybe too comical, but I love it so much. I love that Gimli from Fellowship has grown to the point where he's like, I can't jump the distance. You're gonna have to toss me.
I can't make it.
And Aragorn's like, what? Like there's been so much that's happened to Aragorn this whole time, but it's the first time that besides like Gandalf the White showing back up that he's like befuddled.
Did you just say what I think you said?
And then the whole like just Gimli's just like, just don't tell the elf. Like and he's like not a word. And I love that when you watch them fighting there, eventually it's just them back to back swinging. That can go swing, and then the other one will go swing, and they just keep spinning in a circle of death. And the Uruk-hai are like, I can't. Where'd these guys come from? Like it's so good. And Legolas gets the shot on that one super ladder, which means that I feel like Legolas is kind of undercutting the amount of kills he has in that fight because at the end of the day he's like 42, and I'm like, I don't believe that for a second.
That ladder crushed a lot of people.
I was like, you killed so many, but the one he couldn't kill, our beautiful berserker with the torch, which I think plays so well into the costume design of the Uruk-hai, because you have the berserkers who in the beginning they establish them, they get up the ladders and they jump up and they'll take out like 3 elves at a time, but they don't have a lot of armor. They have like a face mask, the white hands on them. Like, okay, those guys, clearly there's something special about them. And then later on when Legolas can't kill that one, you're like, oh crap, it's one of those guys, like those guys who don't care, because we've already established that old guy who inadvertently shot one of just the regular troopers, they can go down pretty and they're all like, what, which I don't understand military tactics. And I was like, I just start shooting right away. But I love too, though, that the guys who put the bombs in, they're like sappers, or they're like the guys who are also holding the like they'll be crossbowmen, or they'll be holding like the battering ram. They have like these helmets that look a bit different, and you're like, oh, but that's just visual storytelling. No one says, oh, those are sappers and they carry the bombs and they have the crossbows and like they don't do that. Like it's so good. It's so good. And then you have all these other Rohan folks who are like, they're showing like little boys get like a helmet, or they hand them a weapon, and the kids are like, oh my God. Like, like that's
kids.
They're like, here's a pitchfork. Good luck. And you're like, okay. And they're like throwing rocks at them and stuff. It's just so, so good. It's so dang good. I love it
And
so
then, of
much.
course, where like we were talking about earlier, Gandalf comes down the side of that
Uh,
mountain, and man, like just the lighting and just the intensity of it all, it swells so perfectly, and it builds to such a perfect moment. And like, man, I could not have thought of a better way to put together a battle. That
yeah.
battle scene is just incredible from start to finish. The way it sets up the battle, and it kind of sets the stakes, and it shows both sides, and you're like, wow, like these two massive powers. And then just like the meat of the battle, and again, the coolness and the choreography, it's like watching just like planned chaos play out in front of you, and then just the ending with Gandalf. And man, it from start to finish, it is one of the absolute best battle scenes of all time, for sure.
Yeah, the only thing I wish we could have gotten, and I don't think it would have played in this as well, but I miss the one-on-one Aragorn Lurtz fight from Fellowship, and we don't really get anything quite like it again.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
miss kind of that, like, oh, there's one of these guys who is a bit special, and they do have that a little bit in Return of the King, but it's not his fight. It's pretty quick. Uh, I wished we would have had another, because the Uruk-hai just seemed like such an imposing force, and it is a
Yeah.
little confusing to me. I think it's because when Gandalf shows up, I guess maybe now that I'm thinking about it, it's like the light shines, and so the spearmen kind of go like this, and they all get destroyed. But like maybe in that moment, some of them are like, "I'm pretty sure that guy sent us here."
Right.
Like, are there any of
Some
the
of them are probably
Uruk-hai if
confused.
they're like, we gotta go home now, and it's
Yeah.
like they just start running into the trees, and the trees
Yeah.
destroy them, which is
Really good.
great. But man, it's just it's so good because it feels so desperate, and I think Minas Tirith feels desperate in a different way. That one's more about just
Hmm.
sheer terror because you're like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh. But Helm's Deep, you're like, okay, they got a pretty good setup. Like it might not be so
Yeah.
bad. And
It's
then
very strategic. Like you get a
yeah,
sense. I feel like I learned something about like large scale warfare. Like I feel like I
yeah.
left that scene knowing more about how like battles went down. It was really strategic.
Well, it's weird too because like I would think if you were horse lords, you would have like your big battlefield would be like an open plain where you're like, all
Sure.
right, so we're gonna have like 5 different groups of horses just come slaughter from the sides all the time. But I like that it's basically Theoden saying he's like, that stuff's not gonna work. So
Totally.
we're gonna go to our keep, and we're gonna defend our keep, and I know how to defend my keep. And you're like, all right, buddy. And I love there's just that little, and I quote it a lot. Just the whole, is this all you can conjure, Saruman? Kind of like, this
Yeah.
is nothing. And then it's like the
Yep.
wall blows up, and he's like,
It's like, oh
oh,
no.
he's
Yeah.
like, wait a sec, how did that? When did that happen? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's very good. And there's that shot. I don't know which when they start putting the ladders up. And you see like one of the berserkers holding onto the ladder, and they're like start to go up, and I'm like, that's like the two towers shot where you see it, and you're like, oh yeah,
Hmm.
that's two towers. Like,
Yep.
this is
You just know
great.
it.
It's a great film. Yeah, it's. I don't know what I would improve about it. I know some people say it's too long, and maybe that's why they kind of changed some of how the fights went down in
Sure.
Return of the King. But
Yep.
at the same time, it's like, man, it would have been kind of cool, and they kind of do with Blackgate a little bit, not to the same extent. I would love to have seen at one point, or maybe we'll get this in the Amazon show, the
Hmm.
good guys assault a bad fortress.
That would be really
That would
cool.
be
Yeah,
interesting,
like
right?
storming in,
That'd be cool.
for sure.
The other only major sequence in this one, it seems like there's not as much action here, but is the
Hmm.
warg. They kind of just, it seems
Yep.
like kind of it's
Yep.
put in there. It's not a big thing. Obviously, they kind of like get Aragorn out of the fight for a bit. It does give a few great moments with Gimli where he just keeps getting things stacked on top of him,
Yeah. Yeah.
where he's just killing. And one of my favorite lines, "Bring your pretty face to my axe," and he's like, "I'm ready to kill."
Right.
Like Gimli's always ready for killing. He's like,
Absolutely.
yeah, or he's like, "Oh, we're all about to die." He's like, "All right, Gimli, go blow the horn," and he's like, "Yes."
Let's do it.
He's like,
Yeah.
"Let's do it." What did you think about the warg attack? I want to know what you think.
I thought it was good. I think I think the world of Lord of the Rings, and I think specifically the Two Towers, could have used a scene like that where it was just kind of like, I mean, Aragorn's falling off the cliff aside. If we just take that out for the moment and think about the fight sequence itself, and like the approach and the build up to it, I think like, I don't know, there's something very visceral about like bad guys riding things that aren't horses, and
Yeah,
so I think to have like these large hyena type creatures, like I think like if you were to ask, if that scene didn't take place and you were to ask me what I would have added, I would have been like, I don't know, like large hyena riding,
yeah,
like I would have just like thrown some crazy, something like that out. But I feel like it made sense. It made a lot of sense, and it was also just like a good, it was just like a nice little fight scene. It was like a fresh kind of breaking up the sequences of more story building than anything else. So I think it came at like a really perfect time. And then of course, building the stakes with Aragorn's fall. I think, for a second I was probably like, oh my god, Aragorn's dead, but then I was like, nah, he's obviously not dead. I know he's not dead.
Yeah.
But you as a viewer know it, but the people in the movie don't. And so you watching them deal with the stakes of what that means and the implications of his death was really cool. And of course, there's that one scene where I think it was Legolas who finds an orc, or maybe an orc, and he's like, "Where is he?" And he's like, "He fell, ha ha ha." And then like just like that whole back and forth, I'm like, "Ooh, he got the last laugh." Like that feels bad, like it was a good scene.
Oh yeah, and even Gimli gets a moment there too, where he's like,
Yep.
"Tell me what happened, or I'll ease your passing." He's got like the axe to his throat, and I love it because you get a little. Again, you don't get a lot of exchanges between the good guys and the bad guys like that, and it's just so nice to have it because I think they call him Charcu, but he's like holding onto the jewel, the even star, and you're like, to think that an orc of all things would hold the even star for even a moment. You're like, oh, like don't tell Arwen, like
really
like,
twisting the knife there,
Which I was always confused. Like Aragorn must have got his hand or arm caught in some sort of like binding or something on the warg.
So,
Like I've always tried to look at them like, how'd you get caught, buddy? He's a madman. I mean, he gets angry when Haldir dies. He punches an Uruk-hai on a ladder and jumps out into the middle of the army and is like, I'm fine. Like, you're like,
he's just an absolute lunatic.
Yeah, he's like, I've been in a lot of fights. He's like one of those guys in a movie who like almost wants to die, but just can't. And he's like, I'm going to die this time for sure. And they're like, every time you say that, you come back and everybody else is dead. And you're like,
I don't know what happened, just doing my job.
Yeah, totally. I'm fine. It's good. But this movie's all about bad guys writing new things. Like I said with the fell beasts, like you see him flying over the marshes, which marshes are creepy too. That Frodo has to deal with. But I think there's a lot more of action in like the settings around the characters, and not as much like action scenes. Like Fellowship is very much like it seems like every moment is like, oh gosh, there's something else after us. Like, what's this new horrible monster? Or the Crowboys show up, which I think the Crowboys or the Crows are in this for just a second because you see them like in Helm's Deep for like in the daytime. I was like, oh my god, like Saruman's like, they're in Helm's Deep for sure. And and I forgot to mention this earlier, but Grima, we've talked about him a bit. But his kind of once he gets back to Saruman, and this whole like. He's giving him all the intel, and then he's like, how can fire reduce stone? And Saruman's like, please don't
relax.
And in that moment, it's like that kind of comical moment where he's about to kill everybody, like Saruman. But then he's like, even if you had an army, it would take thousands, and Saruman's like tens of thousands. And then it's like the like the order goes off, and you go out there, and that's when that movie I feel like really feels massive because you hear like the big like army, everybody's chanting, and Saruman just puts up like one hand, and they're all like,
they're like, he's gonna say something. He's gonna say something cool.
Say something, Dad.
And you really see Grima's face when he's just like, oh my god. And like, man, he must have felt so. He's like, man, I'm on the winning team. This is great. He must have felt so happy. I love too that he's got one tear coming down his face. Like it's astonishment. He's maybe happy. He's maybe terrified. He's like, oh my gosh. And I like to think the horse he rode in on is still around. I was like, they bring that horse in, and Grima's like, thankfully Rohan gave him a horse after he got kind of exiled pretty quickly. But I just love Isengard so freaking much. I love the Uruk-hai, and I hope that comes through in this video. The Uruk-hai are some of my favorite like grunt warriors of all time. I think they're badass. Like orcs are fine, orcs are cool, and they're more cunning. But I love a big old boy who's just like meets back on the menu boys, which I don't know how they know the word menu. They just do. Like that's like the existential question of the Two Towers. Like, how do they know what a menu is? What?
Like, it's just like they heard it once. Like Saruman said it once, and then they were like, "Sir, a menu."
You say this word, I'm not sure what it means.
Yeah, well, they must come out of the earth knowing a little bit because it seems like Saruman's not like, all right, send the Uruks to class. It's like a 2-week class so they can speak. Like send like 5 of them. I don't
potty
care.
Training and and sword fighting.
And they look so freaking good. And then when they talk, it freaks you out because you're not used to this type of enemy talking. And when they we're talking about the hierarchy and stuff in between them. I love that so much. It's so cool because it
Really
kind of
good.
humanizes them a little bit, and that they have motivations and they've got goals and they've got things they want to do.
Yeah.
Maybe not dreams, but they kind of are like, yeah, we're supposed to do this thing.
They have short-term goals at
Yeah,
least, you
they have
know?
short-term goals, and we're
Yeah,
talking kind of like their infighting earlier here, which they bring up a little bit more in Return of the King, but also that it's not exclusive to them. It's a human thing too, because when
totally.
freaking Aragorn's like, we should call for Gondor, and the Theoden's like, where was Gondor for all this stuff? And I
Yeah.
love that because it's like, man, it seems like everybody's so freaking greedy when it comes to
Yeah,
like, and they're not so
and, like,
different.
man,
You know,
they just love holding grudges. It's like, come on,
love
man,
it.
like, we're about to be taken down by one of the biggest evil forces in this age. Like, you can't put your grudges aside for a moment.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the scene where all the beacons are lit. Like, oh my god, what an incredible, incredible scene.
Oh my gosh, yeah. There's that moment where, yeah, finally Theoden's like, Rohan will answer. I think it's kind of
Yeah,
like it's one of those ones where he's like coming fresh off a win, and he's like,
yeah.
well,
He's like, we're feeling pretty good.
well.
Yeah.
Which reminds me too of like I think it's the Westfold falling, when the
Hmm.
kid's on the horse and they have that whole sequence, and I love that like the kids get to Rohan and kind of tell him what's going on, but then you get that like they're going to Helm's Deep, and you see the same little boy and little girl on a horse, and they obviously made up with their mom later, which is great. But there's
Right.
like the kid's back on the horse, and he looks again like he's so tired. Like he got on the horse for like off the horse for like a couple hours or like a day, and they're like, get back on the
Yeah.
horse. And he's like,
Get out of
he's
here,
like,
kid.
he's like, please, I just want to,
Yeah.
come on, man.
That's it.
It's just please don't make me do this. But I love that there's like that little thread in there where it's like a family. Like a family was uprooted by
Yeah.
this, by the Urukai or the men, like
Yep.
the creepy like wilder men that Saruman
Yeah.
has gotten to mob around him, and he's like,
Right.
swear your allegiance to me, baby. Like
Yeah.
it's so creepy. I love it. Man, what a good movie, right?
It's
Like
incredible,
it
and
holds
again,
up.
like, it is that comfort food for me, and I'm sure for so many people, and, like, man, you could do a whole series of episodes on Tolkien and his approach to writing and his inspirations, but, like, the dude created full languages and these beautifully built out worlds. There is a recording on YouTube, I'll find it for you, and it is a recording of Tolkien reading, The Ride of the Rohirrim, out loud, which I think that's in Return of the King, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think you might be
Um,
right.
and man, it's so cool to hear it out of this guy's voice. And it's just super impactful, super powerful. But I mean, Tolkien is just he set the foundation for so much fantasy writing, and we wouldn't have so much if it weren't for the work that he did and the work that his son did. His son, did so much work after his death, and putting so much work out there. So yeah, man, I'm just like super thankful that this whole IP like exists, and we've been so fortunate to to have such an awesome rendition of it from Peter Jackson. And I'm really excited for the Amazon show. I really hope it holds up. I'm looking forward to it.
That's the hope. And I think, this is one of those few times, at least for me personally, where, and again, because I couldn't get into the books as much, and I think
Mhm.
there's a difference there where the films for me supersede the books. And I think there's such an
Sure.
emotion and a feeling that I get because so many people who read a book and that gets translated into a film, there's so much they have to cut out or they have to change. But the
Yep.
changes they've made and the things they had to take out from the book, I get it. Like I kind of made the joke in Fellowship. I was like, I get why they got rid of Tom Bombadil. It'd
Yeah.
be really hard to put him in there, and people be like,
Yeah.
but that guy should probably be on our like he should work with
Yeah.
us. And I understand that, but there's still something about this one that, man, it really hits home. And I think it's because
Definitely.
it hit me at a very poignant time, and it's just emotional, and I still get emotional about it 20 years
Oh,
later,
for
and
sure.
I'm like,
For sure.
this is so good, and I love it too because it's high fantasy. That's something that's kind of been, it's obviously become way more popularized by something like Harry Potter, to
Yep.
a
Yep.
whole other degree, but there's something about this one where you really do have to dedicate yourself to it, but there's such a payoff to it. Like
Definitely.
there's so much to be had here, so much more than you might get with
Yeah.
other series, and it's like, oh, I
And we
love you
s- and
so
we
much.
see examples of that in Game of Thrones and shows like The Witcher, and now to have this upcoming Amazon show take Middle Earth and turn it into an episodic type of storytelling, I think it's going to be really interesting. I have super high hopes. I'm excited. I have nothing against the fact that it'll be in a different format. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let's be hopeful. The one thing I'm glad about is that we got the Lord of the Rings made a long time ago. Before, like when they made The Hobbit, it was different. It was different kind of
For sure.
WB and stuff. But also, Lord of the Rings doesn't try to be sexy.
Yeah.
Like it
Yeah.
doesn't need to be, and it never has been. And I think if you made Lord of the Rings today, they would say like, we're gonna have to do some stuff to like kind of punch it up a bit. But like Lord of the
Yeah.
Rings, just the way it exists and was just made by people who loved it, and like the pureness of that love. It wasn't like, okay, like let's try to make this a little more crazy than it already is. Like
Yeah.
they didn't. There's gonna be more decapitations because Peter Jackson's like, we're gonna put those in, and it's
Yeah.
like
For
good,
sure.
good. Is there any other things you want to say about Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers before we start to
Oh
wind down
man.
here?
I think no, like it's been awesome just to talk about it, man. Like what an incredible film, and I think it's just like the perfect middle child of this trilogy. And I totally agree with you, best trilogy of all time. I've had this debate with a lot of my friends, a lot of my coworkers, but yeah, man, just an absolutely masterful film, and I'm probably gonna watch it again in the next week. So
That's good.
yeah,
Anybody who says otherwise is wrong, and that's okay.
yeah,
And
definitely.
also, it just brings like-minded people together. And I feel like the people who love Lord of the Rings the most, there's something. I feel like this is gonna be a little biased, but a little something special about them. Like they're
Oh, for
hopeful, they're
sure.
positive people. They're not like, oh my gosh, like I love this trilogy because it's like so messed up and dark and everyone's dying. It's like no, it's like always hope endures and it's
Absolutely.
beautiful. So much connection. I have some notes. We gotta
Let's
get through
hear
these
'em.
notes. We're gonna rapid fire notes. We'll see if you can understand them. They're
All
like
right, let's
mostly
see
one
it.
sentence. The first thing I wrote just that opening exclamation point crazy exclamation point. It is.
Agreed. Yeah,
It's
agreed. Big
unlike
agreed.
anything else in Lord of the Rings. You're like it's almost Super Saiyan-ish for a minute.
Yep.
You're like wow, this is amazing. Movie's way more poetic with its dialogue. We already talked about that.
For
Not
sure.
not a lot of action in that first half. Makeup is nuts. Just makeup is nuts.
Totally.
I think it's when I saw the Uruk-hai talking to the Orc at the beginning. I was like, the Legolas jump. While I get that it's not real when he jumps on the horse for that warg fight, is so
Yeah.
great. Like they could have
Oh,
just
it's
had him
awesome.
jump on in a regular way. He's like, nope, I'm gonna make this look real good.
Yep.
Uh, bring your pretty face to my axe, obviously. Anyone who falls off cliffs in Lord of the Rings comes back stronger. Um,
Yeah.
I feel like if you fall off a cliff, you're like,
That's such a good
I'll
point.
be back.
Yeah.
Which is great. Even I guess you could say that about Frodo too in Return of the
Oh,
King.
for sure.
That's
Yeah, absolutely.
cliffs, man. Fall off a cliff, but
Yeah.
don't
That's how
die.
you level up.
Grima crying at the sight of the army.
Yep.
Arwen still loses in the end. Oh, I love this one. Where
Tragic.
Elrond's like, "Hey, man, if all that stuff happens, you're still gonna lose in the end." And it's like,
Yeah.
oh, I guess you're right.
Yeah.
Like, I
Totally.
love that though. That's so good. I think I love it just because it seems so realistic for him, his
Sure.
point of view, where he's like,
Yeah.
all right, but
It's a
he's
very
like,
logical consequence.
yeah, well, he just feels bad that she didn't fall in love with like another elf, and they could just
Yeah.
be like living forever.
Yep.
They could do weird family dinners for eternity in the
Yep.
Great Havens. The quest will claim Frodo's life. One of my favorite lines
Mm,
because I used to think it was like, oh, he's gonna die, and I think that's what they want you to think. I
sure.
think for me, it's always been the death of his life in the Shire. Like he can't,
Yeah.
like life won't be the same. Like he grew up. Like the
Absolutely.
Shire is his youth, and like he's growing up throughout this, and then he's like, I can't go back. I can't
Yeah.
go back.
He's changed. It's just not the same.
Yeah, it's not the same. I love that. Boromir backstory, so good.
Yep.
Gondor and Rohan, not buddies, which is sad.
Yeah.
Handy kids weapons. I just love it. It's just so it's
Yeah.
Theoden just kind of doing that speech, and they're just like, it's like, oh god.
Yep.
The elves are here. Does Gimli know Elvish? Yes, maybe a little bit. Howard Shore music, 10 out of 10. I feel like I always forget to bring this up. The music in these films is
It's
some of the
incredible.
greatest stuff
Yeah.
that any musician or composer has ever put together. Like, it's
This
so
is from
good.
the Fellowship, but the Bridge of Khazad-dûm from the
Ah,
Fellowship soundtrack. According to Spotify, it was my most played song of 2019 by a significant margin.
dude, it's
So
so good. And like, it comes back, like, the little Fellowship theme was like, they play a
yeah,
little smaller version, like, Legolas is on the shield and he's doing
yeah,
stuff. You're like, and
yeah,
I miss when stuff like Legolas could do that or he jump on a horse, and then they're like, what if in The Hobbit? And I joke about this.
yeah.
They're like, has anti-gravity, and you're like, we need, if we had like 4 or 5 Legolases,
Yeah,
we'd win this whole war. You'd be
totally.
like Sauron would be like, there are 5 elves at my
And
gate,
they're all
and
floating for
they
some reason.
they've killed everyone, and they've killed me. Like they
Yeah,
just
yeah,
feel like it's done.
exactly.
I love it. Let's see. Great heroic moments at Helm's Deep, and then why doesn't Saruman fight? But we talked about that. He's deflated. He doesn't have it. His telekinesis not going to help against these Ents.
It's not going to work. Not
He's
going to cut it.
I can't teleport or telekinesis one of the Ents to me and use them as a staff.
Yeah.
Or could I? He didn't think of it. It
He
was
didn't
too
think of it.
late, and then
Yeah.
his industry got shut down. And I also love how that's, bleeding into Return of the King. That's like the intro to Return of the King,
Yeah.
and that's why that movie, you just can't. I don't think you could ever just step into one of these movies and be like, I'll just start from Return of the King. Like, you'd be like, why is
Right.
this whole place flooded? And there's
Yeah.
what? There's two white wizards?
You got to go through the whole story.
Yeah. I love it. I love it so much. But anyway, that's Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers. So good. Oh my gosh,
It's
I love it so
incredible.
much. And when's the
Yeah.
last time you watched it, Manny? I forget when you said you did.
It was about 2 weeks ago.
Okay, so
It
it's
was
still
about 2
fresh.
weeks ago. Yeah. So I watched The Return of the King less than a week ago, but I watched Two Towers for I don't even remember how many time, about 2 weeks ago.
I was gonna say, I feel like you're the type of guy though, and I'm the same way, where if someone did call you out of the blue and you hadn't watched it, you'd either be like, oh cool, another excuse for me to watch it, even though I watched it last week, or you'd be like,
Totally.
yeah, it's always running up here in the cinema. Like,
Yeah.
you're like, you're like, when you're talking to people and you're like, yeah, I remember that time in Helm's Deep, and people
Yeah.
you're like, oh, sorry, I'm here.
Sorry, what were you saying?
Yeah, I'm so sorry. How do you feel about Gimli and Legolas's relationship? Like, please tell me more. Anyway, which by the way, budding bromances between those two and Sam and Frodo. Like, this movie's all about like, hey bud,
Oh yeah,
like we're getting through hard times
building
together.
friendships.
Build a friendship. It's so good. Like we're doing. It's great.
That's right.
Where art's imitating life is imitating art. I don't know. Anyway, we're gonna start to wind it down here. We're just gonna just two quick little segments, then we're wrapped up. But first off, we got to do, besides movies we've been watching, the games we've been playing, TV shows we've been viewing. It's time to get into some time killers. So Manny, what have you been killing time with, man?
Oh man, it's funny. In the last 2 months since all this quarantine has started, I've purchased maybe 5 full games, and I've played an hour of each of them. I'm a crazy person. Yeah. So, but I actually have been playing a lot of Call of Duty Modern Warfare. I've been playing that with some friends. I've gotten back into this game called Paladins. It's a very Overwatch knockoff type of game.
Yes, I know that one.
Yeah, I played it, man. I played it a lot in 2018, if I remember correctly, and I played it a bunch with my friend. And then there was one specific night where we were on a losing streak, and we said, if we lose one more time, we're uninstalling the game. And that's exactly what happened. And we uninstalled the game. And maybe a month ago, I picked it back up, and I got him back into it. And now we're just loving life. So I've been playing a lot of that. And what else? I've been playing Streets of Rage 4 on the Switch. I've been really
nice.
Yeah, nice little beat 'em up game. It's been a lot of fun. Yeah.
Cool.
And then, like I said, I watched all of Breaking Bad, which was amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And then I watched El Camino directly after, like literally the same night I watched the last 3 episodes. I watched El Camino.
Dang, I still haven't seen that. Is it good?
It's good. It's good. I think there are some like changes, particularly some characters just look different. Some have a pretty significant amount of weight on them, and it's like kind of funny.
Yeah.
But that was good, and I actually started Better Call Saul. And I'm really enjoying that. And then I'm rewatching Sons of Anarchy, which is a show I love very much.
Oh, nice. Sam Crow.
Yeah. All about the club, man.
Dude, I know a little bit about Sons of Anarchy. Not a lot.
Nice.
But cool. Nice.
What about you? What have you been killing time with these days?
I actually binge watched both seasons of Barry. Which I wasn't sure I would like the show, and I don't know if it's because it's like HBO Unlocked for this week and it was on Hulu.
Sure.
Barry is basically a show about a low rent hitman, basically he was in the Marines, and he goes to do a hit in Los Angeles, but then falls in love with acting and then tries to kind of balance this past life of like killing people with trying to become an actor. And as someone who's interested in acting myself, there's so much interesting stuff for that. But it's just such a compelling show. And the episodes are like maybe a half hour, if that. And there's 2 seasons, and there's like 8 episodes each. But it's such a well done dark comedy. There's so much stuff where you're like, oh, that's brutal. It's kind of got the Breaking Bad vibe to it sometimes. But there's also so many great little comedic moments where they're like larger than life characters. And it's so well done. So if anybody gets a chance to watch Barry, please watch it. It's very good. I watched it in like 2 days.
I have to watch season 2. I haven't watched season 2 yet, so I gotta
season 2, man. And I was angry that there wasn't like a season 3 already, but it's kind of a crazy time, and I don't know, like shows like this, I always get worried. I don't know if HBO seems to be better about it, but like Netflix, they'll do like 2 seasons of a show and then like, and it's canceled, and you're like, what? Like, you're like, come on. So it's a great show, really well acted, and Henry Winkler, man. The Fonz, he's so good. And then I don't remember his name, but he plays Fuchs, which Fuchs is basically Barry's handler. He's this guy who's been in a ton of different shows. He is so good, and it's funny
Yeah,
because he also plays the actual man in the high castle from the Man in the High Castle,
yeah,
and he doesn't get a lot to work with there. He's very kind of strange and weird, and there's not much of him. In this one, he really gets to do a full range, and he is
totally.
so good. He was Jimmy James back in like Radio City or something. Like
Yep.
he's been around so long. I love him. And those two, like, man, those two are so great. And Barry, whose name I'm blanking on right now, but
Bill Hader.
Bill Hader, he's
Yeah,
great. He's really good in this.
phenomenal.
And it's fun too. At the end of the episodes, they would do this like look inside the episode. So it was Bill Hader and one of the other guys, like the co-creator, and they'd
Yep.
sit and they talk about the episode, and that was really fun because they'd say like, oh, like on this episode, this and this happened, and this person, we kind of focus on this person, and it's great. So watch Barry. It's very good.
Awesome. Agreed.
I have been playing Gears Tactics.
Oh, nice.
Which has been great. I
Yeah,
really
I've heard good
enjoy
things.
it. It's really good for people. I played a bit of XCOM and XCOM 2, and this one feels like a much better and forgiving entry into that kind of universe of
Yep.
like a tactical shooter, because those games can be very stressful and very frustrating, but this one is not as much. It's much more laid back, I think. At least that's been my experience. And there's the mechanic of overwatching, which is different because if you put a character in XCOM on Overwatch, if they see anything, they'll basically shoot at it. But in this game, you can
Yep.
kind of make a cone depending on the various weapons you have, and that will kind of use up your actions if you'd rather to do it that way, to kind of react as opposed to being proactive. So there's this nice kind of laid back mentality to some of the fights, which is great. Not always, but sometimes you can kind of take your time with it. But I like it. Gears Tactics, man, it's great. My computer
Nice.
could barely run it. My computer's like, Jimmy, it's very hard. It still works. It's fine. It just doesn't look as pretty, I think, as it
Nice,
should.
nice.
But yeah, and Lord of the Rings, Lord of the Rings. What are you gonna say? And
So good.
anything on Disney Plus. I watched a bunch of villain stuff, which by the time this goes out, a brand new wish list, which took me freaking weeks to make, is out. And I hope people like it. It's about
Yeah.
my dream 5th Disney World theme park based on the Disney villains, and it has been a thing I've been working on.
Wow.
It's took me forever to go get all that footage from the movies and all this stuff. But hopefully people like it. I hope they do. You know what? If I get 10 views on it, I'll be stoked. I'll be like, oh,
I'm confident they will love it, my friend.
they better. And if not, that's okay. I still have fun. Anyway, let's move into that last segment of the show, which is community feedback and questions. And I wanted to ask people, well, their thoughts on Two Towers. Like I wanted to know, and I was like, well, some people could write like really long reviews on this, and we have kind of a lengthy response here and there. But let's just get into it. We'll just kind of wrap it up here. Let's see. Here we go. Oh, nice. So this one comes in from Gordon, or Bearded Scotsman 86, as he's known on Discord. He
Nice.
says the tree ant fight with them flooding that area in that big pit that stands out immediately. I really liked them as characters. Who doesn't? The Ents, man. More
Ents are
Ents.
great.
Ents are great. I wish there was more. They don't really get much more play than this, but
Yeah.
it's like the Eagles. You can't just do Ents and Eagles fighting all
Right.
your fights for them. This one comes in from Fraggett, and I think it's really good. He says, I think the movies did wonders to make the events in Two Towers more exciting. So many moments and story enhancements did so much to draw in the feel. For example, the state of Theoden when they arrive, the battle for Helm's Deep was not captured nearly as much in the book as the movie. Not
Mhm.
simply because of the visuals, but the writing style of Tolkien. He focused more on the travel. In the bigger picture, too, the movies, of course, go quick with events. The books are very drawn out. Even in the Fellowship, in the movie, Gandalf sends Frodo out with the ring right away. In the books, there's a lot of time that's passed between Frodo getting the ring and when he starts out on his journey. It's one of the few cases where the movies are better, though, except The Hobbit. He's he's still like,
That is
not-
fair.
yeah, which I think it's funny too, because I like to tell people, if you're a fan of these films, a lot of people like to draw comparisons with Star Wars, and they're like, it's like the prequels and they ruined Star Wars. First off, the prequels did not ruin Star Wars, everybody.
They're
Prequels are
great.
still good, all right? They're great. There's some really freaking great. You know what? And this is a fact that's been popping up more so lately on like the behind the scenes Mandalorian show, but they use more miniatures in episode 1 than they did in any of the old Star Wars movies. So if you think it's all CG, that's not true.
Wow.
But The Hobbit, yeah, maybe The Hobbit wasn't to the same level as Lord of the Rings, but
Yeah.
nothing ever is going to be. That's like
That's the
saying
thing.
it's like finding the largest mountain in the world and then finding any mountain next to it, and you'd be like, well, it's not the
Yeah.
yeah, but it's still a mountain. Like they
Right.
still like The Hobbit for all, there's some great stuff in Hobbit.
Yeah,
Like you
absolutely.
just gotta look for it. It just also tell me if you could take a book that's like this big and make it into 3 films. Because I
Right.
get it with Lord of the Rings. You're like, all right, one book is a movie each. Like,
Right,
but this
exactly.
is like, so yeah, they're gonna draw on other stuff. Oh man. And also I think The Hobbit, one of the reasons I love it so much is it just sets up Lord of the Rings. And if you'd
Oh
never
yeah.
seen Lord of the Rings, the buildup would be nuts because you'd be like,
Oh my God,
these
yeah.
tombs are all open and Gandalf's on the side of a mountain and it's real scary. And you'd be like,
Like, what is
who are these
happening?
guys? Who are the
Yeah.
ghosts? And you're like,
Yep.
oh.
Yep.
I really wish, by the way, that in Battle of the Five Armies, it would have been in the black hoods. They don't
It
always wear
would be
black, but it
really
would have been,
cool.
I would have been like, oh, they're
Yeah,
back. The boys
totally.
are back. Yeah, anyway, thank you for writing in, everybody. I appreciate it. If you guys ever have a topic, a question, or a movie you want us to talk about on the show, or game, or anything else, really, please, all you have to do is tweet the hashtag Critical Podcast. You can tweet at our official account, which is at GoCritical, or you can tweet at me personally. I'm a JimmyGood013. Tweet me a Lord of the Rings gif. If it's
Do
the
it.
you have my sword, you have my axe, like that, or bow, I should say. All that stuff. I love it. I don't care. But if you want to reach Manny, and you just tweet him Lord of the Rings gifts. Manny, where
You
can
can
they
do that
find
too.
you?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. I am at I am Jitsu JITSU. Yeah, man, I love Lord of the Rings more than most things.
Yeah.
So yeah, talk to me about Lord of the Rings, man. I'm always down for
Yeah.
sure.
Yes, and thank you for, again, that was My Future Self, or what was the
Hello, future me.
Hello Future Me. There we go.
Yeah,
Hello
check 'em
Future
out.
Me. Check them out. It sounds really interesting. I feel like I've seen some of that stuff before because those, they call it the YouTube rabbit holes. And if you
Oh yeah.
haven't experienced it, most people have, where it's like you click on one video and you're like, that's pretty good. And then they have like a recommended one. You're like, watch that one too. And then it's like
Oh
6
yeah.
hours later and you're like,
Like,
uh-oh.
what day is it?
You're like, who am I? But in these
Yeah.
weird times, maybe it's okay to get a little figuring out. Like there's the Maiar and the Valar. Like they're two
Yeah.
separate but similar levels.
Yeah, educate yourself.
Yeah. But Manny, an absolute pleasure for me
As
always
always,
when you're on
man.
the show, man. It's like I was like, oh, Manny's gonna be on the show. Yes, let's do it.
Likewise, dude. Like I said, any excuse to hang out with you is a good one, and any excuse to talk about Lord of the Rings with you is an even better one. So happy to be here, man. Thanks so much for having me. This was an absolute blast. Seriously.
Well, good. Well, you never know when I'll just like reach out, be like, Manny, you want to be back on the show sometime? This is a Lord of the Rings podcast now. We're just all right. We're gonna go through scene by scene each episode. Be like, okay,
I love it.
Today it's just we're hanging out in Bag End, so everybody just be cool. Yeah, but I appreciate it. I appreciate you, and I appreciate everybody listening. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our patrons who make this possible. Thank you for supporting us. You're seeing the names right over here, and if you want to donate at that $5 tier and up, you'll get your name over here. And I appreciate you. I love you so much, and thank you for everybody for putting in their questions and being patient with us, not only on this video but also on the villains wish list video. Oh gosh, I hope you guys like it. Anyway, thank you for so much, and until next time, just remember to adapt and overcome.